Hey guys, tonight we're taking a little trip. Not to a battlefield or a royal court, but somewhere much quieter, more refined. We're going to a grand, old art museum after hours. Imagine we have the whole place to ourselves. The only sound is the echo of our footsteps on the marble floors. But don't get too comfortable in this elegant setting. The story we're about to uncover is anything but. It's a tale so strange that if you were an artist back then, you might have unwittingly participated in something truly bizarre. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Let me know in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The air inside is cool and still, carrying the faint, pleasant scent of old wood, linseed oil, and time itself. You wander through halls lined with portraits of stern-faced dukes and serene ladies, their painted eyes following you as you pass. You drift by vast landscapes and dramatic biblical scenes. But then, you stop. One painting in particular has caught your eye. It's from the 19th century. Maybe something by a pre-Raphaelite painter, one of those artists obsessed with myth, romance, and an almost photographic level of detail. The canvas depicts a scene from an old legend. A night in dark. Gleaming armor stands in a shadowy forest. The moonlight filters through the gnarled branches, illuminating the face of a sleeping princess she's just discovered. It's beautiful, melancholic, and deeply atmospheric. You lean in a little closer, admiring the technique, the shimmer of the armor, the delicate blush on the princess's cheek, the velvety texture of her gown. But what really holds your attention are the shadows. The deep, rich, warm browns that define the forest, the earth, the darkness in the folds of the night's cloak. It's a peculiar shade of brown. It's not flat or muddy like some earth pigments. It has a unique transparency, a certain glow, as if it's lit from within. It gives the shadows a depth that feels almost alive. You can see other colors subtly showing through it, creating a layered, luminous effect that is notoriously difficult for painters to achieve. You look at the little brass plaque on the wall next to the painting. It tells you the artist's name, the title, The Enchanted Sleep, and the year it was painted, 1880. Standard stuff. What it doesn't tell you, what no museum plaque would ever dare to mention, is the secret ingredient that gives that specific brown its haunting beauty. Art historians have spent countless hours on this painting. This is a well-established fact of the art world. They analyzed brushstrokes, debate the symbolism of the wilting flower at the princess's feet, and write entire books on the artist's tragic love life and how it influenced his work. They laud his mastery of light and shadow, especially his use of chiaroscuro, that dramatic contrast between light and dark. But there's a secret hiding in plain sight, a material truth that shifts the painting from a simple masterpiece into something far more unsettling. The peculiar quality of that brown pigment has been a source of quiet discussion in conservation circles for a long time, for decades. The academic world has been locked in a subtle debate about the composition of certain historical pigments. Some argued this specific brown's unique transparency came from asphaltum, a tar-like substance, or perhaps a rare blend of resins and oils. They developed complex theories, analyzing samples and comparing notes from old artistic treatises. But the reality is stranger, more macabre, and frankly, more unbelievable than any academic theory. You're looking at that soft brown pigment, the one used to shade the hollow of the sleeping princess's throat, and you have no idea that you're staring at a ghost. The story of that color didn't begin in an artist's studio or a chemical lab. It began thousands of years earlier, in a tomb under the hot, dry sands of the Egyptian desert. That pigment, the one giving the forest its haunting depth and the night's cloak its velvety shadow, had a name that was both brutally honest and, for a very long time, deceptively metaphorical in the minds of many who used it. It was called mummy brown, and its key ingredient was exactly what the name suggests: Yes, you heard that right. For centuries, one of the most sought-after brown pigments in the European art world was made from the ground-up remains of ancient Egyptian mummies, human beings, and sometimes cats, who had been embalmed and laid to rest thousands of years ago, were exhumed, sold, shipped across the Mediterranean, and ground into a fine powder to be mixed with oil and painted onto a canvas. The very shadows you are admiring in that painting, the ones that create its mood and mystery, in a literal sense, composed of a person. The recipe was hideously simple and was even published in art supply catalogs and manuals of the day. You would take a mummy, the whole thing, wrappings and all, and grind it down into a powder. The quality of the final pigment, however, was notoriously inconsistent. This is a well-documented frustration for the artists who used it. A mummy from the Pharaonic era, rich with dark resins and bitumen used in the embalming process, would yield a beautiful, transparent, deep brown. But a mummy from the later Greco-Roman period, preserved with cheaper materials, might produce a duller, grittier, and less desirable color. The linen wrappings, the desiccated flesh, the powdered bones, and the ancient embalming agents all combined to create this unique pigment. The primary binding agents added to this, human dust, were white pitch and myrrh. That's it. That was the formula. Now you might be thinking this is some obscure, ghoulish fad practiced by a few fringe artists, but it wasn't. Mummy Brown was a commercially available, mainstream art supply. You could walk into a reputable artist's colourman shop in London or Paris, like Robinson Co. or Le Franc Bourgeois, and buy a tube of it right off the shelf, sitting there next to the ultramarine blue and the vermilion red. It was particularly popular with the pre-Raphaelites, the group of artists we imagined painting our scene in the museum. They loved its transparency and richness. It was perfect for creating deep, luminous glazes, thin layers of transparent paint that modify the colors underneath. When you wanted to paint the lustrous brown of a violin, the warm shadow on a stone wall, or the soulful depths of a sitter's eyes, Mummy Brown was often the pigment of choice. Here's a bizarre little tidbit for you. The very name of the pigment is a source of historical confusion. The term sometimes used for it, caput mortuum, is Latin for dead head or worthless remains. This term originally referred to the residue left over from chemical experiments in alchemy. Over time, it also became the name for a specific, very respectable pigmented arc purplish brown made from iron oxide, completely unrelated to human remains. However, because the name was so evocative, it was also sometimes applied to Mummy Brown. Art historians to this day are locked in debate when they read an old studio inventory or an artist's diary that lists a purchase of caput mortuum. Did the artist buy the common, stable iron oxide pigment, or did they buy the tube containing a 3,000-year-old Egyptian in many cases? It's impossible to know for sure without modern chemical analysis of the painting itself. The records are ambiguous, and the artists themselves may not have even been fully aware of the distinction. Imagine yourself as that 19th century artist. You love this new brown pigment. It handles beautifully, allowing you to build up shadows with a depth you've never achieved before. The supply catalog from your favorite art store describes it as being made from Egyptian mummy. But in an age before the internet, before photography was widespread, what does that even mean to you? Mummy is just an exotic sounding word. It's a substance, a material, like ivory or sepia, which, by the way, comes from the ink sac of a cuttlefish. You probably imagine it's some kind of tar or resin scraped from the tombs. Not the tomb's actual occupants. The name is a grotesque marketing gimmick, you might assume. Surely, no one is actually grinding up people, right? So you keep painting. You use it to render the soft, dark hair of a portrait. You use it to paint the fertile earth in a landscape. You use it to shade the body of Christ in a crucifixion scene. An irony that is almost too heavy to bear. The very substance you are using to depict life, faith, and beauty is the desiccated remnant of a human life that ended millennia ago. That person had a name, a family, and a belief system that promised them an eternal afterlife. An afterlife that depended on their body remaining intact. And here you are, smearing their physical form across a canvas to get a nice shadow effect under a knight's arm. The distance of time and culture had rendered these ancient people into mere raw material. A curiosity, an ingredient. But how did this happen? How did an entire civilization's sacred dead become a commercial product? A pigment available for purchase. To understand that, we have to rewind a bit, to the moment when Europe suddenly, and violently, rediscovered Egypt. It's a fair question to ask. How does an entire society, a so-called enlightened and civilized society, arrive at the conclusion that grinding up human beings is a perfectly acceptable way to make a new shade of brown? It feels like a monstrous leap of logic. But it wasn't a leap, it was a slow, creeping process. To understand it, you have to understand that for centuries, before it became a pigment, the mummy was an object of intense, almost delirious fascination. Europe had a fever, and that fever was called Egyptomania. This wasn't just a 19th century fad. The obsession with ancient Egypt has deep, tangled roots going back centuries. Let's put you in the shoes of a wealthy, educated European in, say, the mid-1700s, before the big explosion of interest. For you, Egypt isn't really a country. It's a dreamscape. It's a land half history, half fable, a place you know only through a handful of ancient texts and biblical stories. You've read the accounts of the Greek historian Herodotus, who wrote about Egypt with wide-eyed wonder, describing bizarre rituals and colossal monuments. You know it as the land of Moses and the pharaohs. You've seen sketches of the pyramids and the Sphinx. And maybe you've even seen a real Egyptian obelisk. But it would have been in Rome, where ancient emperors had carted them off as trophies. For you, Egypt is less a geographical location and more of a concept, the source of all secret knowledge. It's the home of Hermes Trismegistus, the legendary founder of alchemy and magic. It's the cradle of a civilization so ancient and so powerful that its achievements seem almost supernatural, and the most potent symbols of this lost power are its indecipherable writings and its perfectly preserved dead. You stare at drawings of hieroglyphs, and you don't see a language. No one does. The knowledge of how to read them has been lost for over 1,000 years. To you and your contemporaries, these are not letters forming words. They are mystical symbols, magical keys that could unlock the secrets of the universe. If only you could figure them out. This is a crucial point. It dehumanized the ancient Egyptians. You didn't see them as people who wrote shopping lists, love poems, or tax receipts, all of which we now know they did. You saw them as a race of priests and magicians who communicated in pure, universal ideas. And this view was built on a foundation of questionable sources. This is where a major academic debate comes in. Historians still argue about the reliability of ancient writers like Herodotus. When he described Egyptian customs, was he acting as a diligent journalist, carefully recording what he saw, or was he more of a travel blogger, writing down the most sensational and entertaining stories he was told by his local guides and translators, without much fact-checking for a long time? Europe took these ancient accounts as gospel, building a vision of Egypt that was part fantastical, part misunderstood, and almost entirely stripped of its everyday humanity. In this context, a mummy is not the body of a deceased person. It's not Grandfather Amenhotep who liked fishing on the Nile. It is a relic. It is a vessel containing the secrets of that magical civilization. It survived for millennia, perfectly preserved by mysterious techniques. Surely, you think, it must possess some of that mysterious power. It must hold the key to longevity, to health, to a knowledge that your own modern science can't comprehend. This is the mindset that allowed the mummy to be transformed from a sacred vessel for the soul into a raw material. It's a process of objectification. The immense distance in time and culture made it easy. These weren't people anymore, they were artifacts. They were curiosities to be displayed in a cabinet, alongside a strange seashell and a piece of Roman pottery. They were a potent symbol of a lost world. A world that Europeans felt an obsessive need to possess, to consume. to literally absorb. So this fascination was simmering away for centuries among scholars, alchemists, and the wealthy elite. It was a niche obsession, confined to dusty libraries and private collections. But for it to become a mainstream craze, for the demand for mummies to become so great that it would spawn an entire industry, something needed to happen. This simmering curiosity, this potent myth of a magical Egypt, needed a spark to ignite it into a raging fire. It needed to be brought out of the realm of legend and into the public eye in a spectacular fashion. That spark was about to arrive on a fleet of warships, carrying an army, a legion of scientists, and one very ambitious, very famous French general. The world was about to be formally introduced to Egypt, and Egypt was about to be introduced to the full, rapacious force of European desire. The year is 1798. You find yourself standing on a crowded quay in the French port of Toulon. The air is thick with the smell of salt, tarred rope, and nervous excitement. All around you, soldiers are marching onto transport ships. Cannons are being hoisted aboard, and officers are shouting orders. You are part of an immense undertaking. An army of over 40 Jarrow soldiers and a fleet of hundreds of ships are preparing to set sail under the command of a brilliant, charismatic, and alarmingly ambitious 29-year-old general named Napoleon Bonaparte. But this isn't just a military invasion. Squeezing onto the ships alongside the soldiers and horses is a most unusual group. You see them huddled together, clutching notebooks and sketching pads, their luggage filled not with ammunition but with measuring tapes, scientific instruments, and dreams of paper. There are 167 of them in total. They are engineers, botanists, geologists, chemists, artists, and historians. They are the savants, the scholars of the Commission des Sciences et des Arts, and they are as vital to Napoleon's mission as his cannons. Officially, the goal of this expedition is strategic. Napoleon, representing the new French Republic, intends to conquer Egypt to disrupt Britain's valuable trade routes to India. That's the part everyone knows, the mainstream historical fact. But Napoleon has a second, much grander ambition. He sees himself not just as a conqueror, but as an heir to Alexander the Great. He isn't just going to seize a territory, he is going to civilize it and, more importantly, he is going to uncover, document, and claim its ancient glories for France. He is launching not just a military campaign, but a scientific one. He is going to systematically unlock the secrets of that dreamscape Egypt that has captivated European minds for so long. You set sail. The journey across the Mediterranean is tense. The British Royal Navy, under the command of Horatio Nelson, is hunting for you. After narrowly avoiding them, your fleet lands near Alexandria. The conquest of Egypt itself is swift and brutal. You witness the Battle of the Pyramids, where Napoleon famously rallies his troops with the cry, "Soldiers, from the tops of these pyramids, 40 centuries look down upon you." It's a fantastic soundbite, and it perfectly captures the spirit of the enterprise. This is a clash not just of armies, but of eras. As the French army secures control, the savants get to work. Imagine the scene. You are with them as they fan out across the country. For the first time, trained European scientists and artists are encountering the monuments of ancient Egypt, not as blurry sketches in a book, but in their staggering, sun-blasted reality. You stand at the base of the temples at Karnak and Luxor, craning your neck back to take in the colossal statues and the forests of towering columns covered in hieroglyphs. You help stretch a measuring tape across the face of the Great Sphinx. You crawl into the stifling, dark passageways of tombs that have been sealed for 3,000 years. Your torchlight illuminating walls covered in vibrant, pristine paintings. Everything is being measured, sketched, catalogued, and described with a frantic, systematic energy. This is a crucial turning point. The old, mystical idea of Egypt is being overlaid with a new, scientific one. But this science is an active possession. It's not a collaboration, it's an extraction. And here's a little known, chaotic detail of that expedition while the savants were trying to be scientific. The soldiers were often anything but. They were bored, hurt, and unimpressed. They saw the ancient temples as convenient sources of stone for fortifications. They carved their names in graffiti all over priceless monuments. And, most importantly, they started digging. Looking for treasure, for souvenirs, for anything they could sell. It was this chaotic, uncontrolled looting by common soldiers, happening alongside the systematic work of the savants, that really kick-started the mummy trade. They were the first to realize that there was a seemingly endless supply of mummies just under the sand, and that people back home might be interested in them. Historians are still debating the true legacy of this scientific commission. Was it a pioneering act of archaeology and scholarship that laid the groundwork for modern Egyptology, or was it an act of cultural plunder on an epic scale? The intellectual arm of an imperialist invasion? The truth, as is often the case, is a messy combination of both. The expedition itself would end in military failure. Nelson finally caught the French fleet and destroyed it at the Battle of the Nile. The French army was left stranded and was eventually defeated. But the scientific mission was a resounding success. The savants returned to France not with territory, but with something far more lasting: crates and crates of drawings, notes, and artifacts. Among these was a certain black slab of stone found by a soldier in the town of Rosetta, inscribed with the same text in 3 different scripts. But its true significance wouldn't be understood for another 2 decades. Back in Paris, the government commissioned the creation of a monumental work to publish the savants' findings. It was called the Description de l'Egypte. It was a colossal, multi-volume masterpiece filled with incredibly detailed engravings of every temple, tomb, and artifact they had documented. When these volumes began to be published, they set Europe on fire. Suddenly, the vague, mythical Egypt of old was replaced with a concrete, detailed, and utterly irresistible vision. The floodgates were open. Napoleon had kicked down the door to the tomb, and now all of Europe was about to rush inside, looking for its own piece of history. The Description de l'Egypte lands in the drawing rooms and libraries of Europe like a spark in a tinderbox. The detailed engravings and scholarly texts transform Egypt from a distant legend into a tangible, desirable commodity, and what is the most accessible, most morbidly fascinating commodity of all: the mummy. Suddenly, everyone who is anyone wants a piece of ancient Egypt. And the most potent symbol of that civilization is a preserved body. Welcome to the era of Egyptomania. You are now in Victorian England, the heart of this craze. Let's say it's the 1832s. Egypt is everywhere. The new wing at the British Museum is mobbed with people clamoring to see the colossal statues and sarcophagi that have been acquired from the Nile Valley. Furniture is being designed with sphinx heads for legs and lotus flower motifs. Ladies are wearing amulets and scarab-shaped brooches. Even architecture is infected. Grand cemeteries are building Egyptian-style gateways, and a factory in Leeds has a chimney shaped like an obelisk. In this atmosphere of obsessive fascination, a new and utterly bizarre form of social entertainment is born: the mummy unwrapping party. You've received an invitation. It's not for a ball or a dinner, but for an unrolling. The host is a man named Thomas Mummy Pettigrew, a surgeon and antiquarian who has become the master of ceremonies for these events. You arrive at his grand London home, or perhaps a lecture hall he's rented for the occasion. The room is packed with the social elite: lords and ladies, politicians, famous authors, artists, all buzzing with anticipation. On a table at the front of the room, under the bright gaslights, lies a long, linen-wrapped object. It's a real ancient Egyptian mummy, purchased from a dealer who got it from a tomb robber in Luxor. Pettigrew, a natural showman, steps up to the table. He begins his lecture, explaining the history of Egyptian burial practices, referencing Herodotus and the great savants of Napoleon's expedition. He builds the suspense. Then, he picks up a pair of shears. A hush falls over the room. You lean forward, trying to get a better view. He makes the first cut. He begins to unwind the linen bandages. which are often stiff and brittle with aging resins. The process takes a surprisingly long time, sometimes hours. Yard after yard of ancient fabric is unspooled and passed around the audience for inspection. People finger the material that last touched human skin 3,000 years ago. As the layers come off, the anticipation melts. Sometimes small treasures are found tucked within the wrappings, a string of beads, a carved amulet, a sacred scarab beetle. Each discovery is met with gasps of excitement from the crowd. Finally, the last layer of linen is removed. The preserved body is revealed. There is a collective intake of breath. Sometimes the preservation is remarkable, the features still discernible. Other times, the body is little more than a blackened skeleton. Either way, the spectacle is considered a roaring success. It's science, it's history, it's a social event, and it's a thrilling brush with mortality, all wrapped up in one. After the unwrapping, Pettigrew would often perform a sort of autopsy, examining the body for signs of disease or cause of death, further blending the line between scientific inquiry and macabre spectacle. This is the mainstream historical view of these events, a well-documented and bizarre chapter of Victorian society. But here's a lesser-known aspect: the sheer banality of it all. While we imagine these events as dramatic and profound, for many attendees, it was just another Tuesday night's entertainment. The diaries and letters of the time reveal a strange mix of genuine intellectual curiosity and casual, almost callous, party-going. People would comment on the unpleasant smell and then move on to gossiping about who was in attendance. Furthermore, historians still debate the true nature of the mummies being unwrapped. The supply chain was incredibly murky. While some were genuine antiquities, many were likely fakes, cobbled together by clever forgers in Egypt to meet the insatiable European demand. Some were probably recent corpses, hastily embalmed and aged to look ancient. There was no real way for Pettigrew or his clients to be sure. Was the mummy you just saw unrolled the body of an ancient priestess? Or was it a 19th century fisherman from Alexandria? There was no scientific way to tell. The climax of the evening for you isn't just seeing the body, it's what happens afterwards. The host might present small squares of the mummy's linen wrapping to his guests as party favors. You might go home with a piece of the 3,000-year-old burial shroud in your pocket, a souvenir from your thrilling night out. The body itself, it might be donated to a museum, or its skull might end up as a paperweight on a gentleman's desk, and the rest of it, the less interesting bits, the torso, the limbs, the dust and fragments left over from the unwrapping. What happens to them? They are often simply gathered up. They've served their purpose as entertainment. No, they're just organic waste. But some people saw this waste as a resource. An apothecary, perhaps, or an artist's color man in the audience might be thinking, all that resin-soaked, well-cured organic material, it would grind up rather nicely. The unwrapping parties, by physically dismantling the mummies and turning them into a collection of pots, made the next step seem much less transgressive. You're not destroying a sacred human form anymore. You're just sweeping up the leftovers from a party. And these leftovers were about to find a new, and even stranger, purpose. Before they were paint, they were medicine. Long before the pre-Raphaelites ever dipped a brush in mummy brown, and even before Napoleon Savants measured a single stone, Europeans were already consuming mummies, not with their eyes at a society party, but literally, they were eating them, for centuries. A substance known as mummia was a staple of the European apothecary, a prescribed remedy for an astonishingly wide range of ailments. To understand this, we need to adjust our timeline. Let's travel back further. Long before the Egyptomania craze, it's the 12th century. You're a physician in Salerno, Italy, a center of medical learning. Your knowledge is a blend of Greek and Roman texts that have been preserved and expanded upon by scholars in the Islamic world. One of the most respected medical texts on your shelf is a translation of a work by a Persian physician. In it, he describes the amazing medicinal properties of a rare substance found in the mountains of Persia, natural bitumen, or pitch. He calls it mummia. He claims this black, terry substance is excellent for setting bones, healing wounds, and treating everything from headaches to nausea. Here's where a colossal, world-changing misunderstanding occurs. This is the mainstream theory for the origin of medicinal mummia. When European translators worked on these texts, they encountered the word mummia. They knew that the ancient Egyptians used a black, resinous substance in their embalming process. They looked at the blackened, resin-soaked bodies coming out of Egypt and put two and together, getting a spectacular five. They mistakenly concluded that the medicinal mummia the Persian doctor was praising was not the natural mineral pitch from a mountain, but the substance scraped from the inside of Egyptian mummies. The logic was, if this stuff can preserve a body for thousands of years, imagine what it could do for a living one. So, the trade began. At first, it was just the bitumen and resin scraped from the wrappings and cavities of mummified bodies. But as demand grew, supplies of this authentic mummy tar dwindled. So, enterprising merchants simply started grinding up the entire mummy flesh, bones, bandages, and all. This powder, a brownish black and pungent substance, became the new standard for medicinal mummia. Now, fast forward to the 16th century. You're living in London. You've come down with a nasty cough, or maybe some painful bruises from a fall. You go to the local apothecary. The shop is dark, filled with the scent of dried herbs and strange chemicals. The apothecary, a serious-looking man in a long coat, listens to your symptoms, nods gravely, and then turns to his rows of wooden drawers. He pulls one out, labeled mummia, and scoops out a measure of a coarse, dark powder. He tells you to mix it with wine and drink it, or to blend it into a solvent and apply it to your bruises. The cost is high. This is an exotic import, a powerful medicine from the mystical land of the pharaohs. You take it home and follow his instructions, trying not to think too hard about what you're swallowing. This wasn't some fringe quackery. Mummia was a standard, legitimate pharmaceutical. It was prescribed by respected physicians and even royalty. King Francis I of France was said to have carried a pouch of mummia with him at all times in case of emergency. It was considered a panacea, a cure for everything from epilepsy and vertigo to poisoning and plague sores. But here's a weird little fact. Even back then, there were skeptics. Not everyone was convinced. One of the most vocal critics was a French surgeon named Ambroise. He was a battlefield doctor, a practical man. He questioned the whole business, famously writing that it was absurd to think that the bodies of these ancient Egyptians, which had been dead for 1500 years or more, could possibly provide any benefit to the living. He argued, quite reasonably, that it did nothing but cause a pain in the stomach. Historians of medicine are still trying to sort out how widespread this skepticism was. Was Père alone voice of reason in a sea of credulity? Or was he representing a significant minority of medical professionals who thought the whole practice was ridiculous? The evidence is, as you might guess, ambiguous. The supply chain for this medicine was, unsurprisingly, horrific. It fueled a massive industry of tomb robbing in Egypt. Local villagers would desecrate ancient necropolises, hunting for bodies to sell to European merchants. When the supply of ancient mummies couldn't keep up with demand, a gruesome cottage industry of counterfeiting sprang up. Unscrupulous dealers would take the bodies of executed criminals, vagrants, or people who had died from disease, fill them with bitumen, dry them in the sun, and pass them off as authentic pharaonic mummies. You, the 16th century Londoner with a headache, had no way of knowing if your expensive medicine was made from a 3-0-year-old priest or a recently deceased camel driver from Cairo. This practice of eating mummies continued for an astonishingly long time, well into the 18th century. It only began to fall out of fashion as medical science advanced and the new ideas of the Enlightenment took hold. Doctors started to favor chemical remedies and botanical drugs over ground-up corpses. The apothecary drawers full of mummia began to gather dust. But just as the medical demand was fading, a new group of customers was about to discover this strange, dark powder. A group of people who were also obsessed with longevity, preservation, and the strange alchemy of mixing powders with oils. The artists were about to raid the medicine cabinet. The apothecary shop is changing. It's the late 18th and early 19th century now. The age of reason has cast a harsh light on many old traditions, and the idea of eating ground-up mummies for your health is starting to seem, well, a little medieval. The demand for medicinal mummia is plummeting. The apothecary, who once did a brisk trade in this morbid panacea, now finds himself with a surplus of a rather unsellable product. He has jars and barrels of this fine, dark, resinous powder, and it's just taking up shelf space. Meanwhile, just down the street, another kind of shop is thriving. It's the artist color man. This is where painters come to buy their supplies: pre-mixed paints in pig's bladders and later, tin tubes, hunt bristle brushes, stretched canvases, and exotic pigments from all over the world. You are an artist of this period, and you are constantly on the hunt for new and interesting colors, especially good, reliable browns. Browns are notoriously tricky. You can mix them, of course, from red, yellow, and blue, but the results can be muddy and lifeless. Natural earth pigments like umber and sienna S are good, but they can be opaque and heavy. A very popular brown at the time is bitumen, or asphaltone. It's the same natural tar that was the original, misunderstood MUMMIES. Artists love it because it creates a beautiful, rich, deep brown with a lovely glossy finish. It's perfect for the dark, dramatic shadows favored by the old masters, but bitumen has a fatal flaw: it never truly dries. A well-known technical problem is that paintings that used a lot of bitumen are famous for cracking, wrinkling, and alligatoring over time as the paint continues to shift. The dark areas of the canvas can literally melt and slide downwards in warm weather. Sir Joshua Reynolds, a famous English painter, was a notorious abuser of bitumen, and many of his paintings are now in a ruinous state because of it. So you, the artist, are looking for a brown that has the richness and transparency of bitumen but is more stable. This is where the paths of the apothecary and the artist converge. Somewhere in history has sadly not recorded the name of this morbidly practical genius made a connection. What if that leftover mummy powder from the apothecary shop could be used as a pigment after all? It was primarily composed of bitumen and resins, the very things that gave the problematic paint its beautiful color, but it was mixed with desiccated organic matter and bone. Perhaps this filler would act as a stabilizer. The human dust might just be the secret ingredient to perfect the imperfect brown. This transition is a major point of study. Art historians and conservators have meticulously traced the appearance of mummy brown in painting manuals and color men's catalogues. It starts appearing in the late 18th century, right as medicinal mummia is falling out of favor. The first documented mention of it as a pigment is generally cited as being in the 1798 Compendium of Colors published in London. The description is chillingly straightforward, noting that it is fleshy and made from the mummy of Egypt. Imagine the scene in the color man's workshop. HES acquired a supply of mummy powder from the apothecary. He takes a scoop of the dark, gritty stuff and places it on a heavy stone slab. He adds a dollop of linseed oil. Then, with a glass muller, a sort of pestle with a flat bottom, he begins to grind, back and forth, in a circular motion, for hours. The goal is to get the pigment particles as fine as possible and perfectly suspended in the oil. The resulting paint is a revelation. It's a beautiful, warm, transparent brown. It has the depth of bitumen but seems to handle better on the palate. It's not as greasy or slick. It has a good body. And here's a strange little detail about the process: the quality of the final paint was incredibly variable, a fact that both frustrated and intrigued artists. The color man might not know the exact vintage of his mummy, a mummy from an earlier dynasty, embalmed with high-quality resins, might produce a spectacular pigment. A later, Ptolemaic era mummy, preserved more simply, might yield a coarser, less satisfactory paint. Some batches were even said to have a slightly gritty texture, which historians now believe was likely due to poorly ground up bones or sand from the tomb. There is, of course, A debate among art historians about how much the average artist actually knew. When you bought a tube of mummy brown, did you really understand what it was? The name was a clue. Certainly, but in an era that romanticized the exotic, it could have been interpreted as a trade name, a brand. Some probably knew and didn't care. The final effect on the canvas was what mattered. Others were likely oblivious, trusting their color man to provide them with quality materials, and some, as we will later see, were horrified when they eventually learned the truth. So the apothecary's leftover medicine, born from a linguistic misunderstanding under disregard for the dead, found a new life. It moved from the medicine cabinet to the artist's palate. The same substance that was once swallowed to cure a fever was now being used to paint a serene landscape. The mummy had completed its bizarre journey of commodification. It had been a sacred vessel, a magical relic, an object of scientific curiosity, a party favor, and a dubious medicine. Now, it had become a color, an ingredient for creating beauty, its horrific origins elegantly concealed within a slim to buff paint. With a new market established in the art studios of Europe, the demand for mummies, which had been waning, roared back to life. But this wasn't the old trade of selling whole bodies to collectors and showmen. This was a grittier, more industrial demand. The color men didn't need pristine, well-preserved mummies suitable for display. They needed bulk. They needed raw material for the grinder. This created a vast, dark, and ruthlessly efficient supply chain that stretched from the back alleys of London to the desecrated tombs of the Nile. Let's put you in the middle of this chain. It's the 1842. You're not a fancy artist or a wealthy collector. You're a middleman, a European import agent living in Cairo. Your job is to acquire antiquities for your clients back home. And right now, the hot ticket item is mummies. Not for unwrapping parties, that's a high-end, bespoke market. You're in the bulk mummy business. Your day doesn't involve scholarly trips to grand temples. It involves clandestine meetings and smoky coffee houses with local dealers. These are the men who orchestrate the first, and most dangerous, part of the supply chain, the acquisition. They are, in plain terms, the managers of gangs of tomb robbers. Tomb robbing in Egypt was, by this point, a centuries-old tradition, but the European demand supercharged it into a full-blown industry. This is a well-documented part of 19th-century Egyptian history. Entire villages, particularly around the ancient necropolis of Thebes, modern-day Luxor, essentially gave up farming and dedicated themselves to archaeology, which was really just a euphemism for plundering the tombs of their ancestors. You, the agent, place an order. You made, say, half a ton of mummified remains. You don't care about the quality of the preservation or whether they have gilded masks. You just need bodies. Your local contact dispatches his teams. These aren't archaeologists with brushes and trowels. These are men with shovels, pickaxes, and dynamite. They swarm over the hillsides honeycombed with tombs, blasting their way into burial chambers that have been sealed for millennia. The destruction is immense. They smash sarcophagi, toss aside funerary objects that aren't obviously valuable, and drag the mummies out into the harsh sunlight. They aren't just looking in the famous, royal tombs, they are plundering the vast, sprawling cemeteries of ordinary people, priests, officials, craftsmen, and their families, tens of thousands of them, buried with the same hope of eternal life. Their bodies, their identities, their final resting places are all being systematically destroyed to meet a commercial demand thousands of miles away. Here's a bizarre and grim little fact from this era. Mark Twain, the famous American author, wrote about his travels in Egypt in his 1816 book The Innocents Abroad. He described, with his trademark dry wit, a bizarre use for mummies he had witnessed. He wrote that the Egyptians were using them as fuel for their steam locomotives. He deadpanned, I shall not speak of the railway, for it is like any other railway. But the fuel is composed of mummies 3,000 years old, purchased by the ton or by the graveyard for that purpose. He claimed the mummies burned exceptionally well due to the resins. Now, academic debate rages over this claim. Was Twain telling the literal truth? Or was he using satirical hyperbole to comment on the shocking commodification of the dead he saw all around him? Some historians argue that it's unlikely, as wood or coal would have been more efficient. Others argue that in a country with few trees, and given the sheer glut of mummies available, it's entirely plausible that they were used as a convenient, if gruesome, source of fuel. There is no definitive proof either way, but the very fact that the story was believable at the time tells you everything you need to know about how little value was placed on these human remains. Back to your role as the middleman. The tomb robbers bring their haul to a warehouse. Here, the mummies are processed. They are stripped of any remaining bits of linen that can be sold to paper mills and other charming 19th century industry, and the bodies are broken up for easier shipping. They are packed into crates or stuffed into sacks, no different from any other commodity like cotton or grain. You then arrange for shipping. You bribe the right port officials to look the other way, and the crates are loaded onto a merchant ship bound for Liverpool or Marseille. The customs declaration might vaguely read medical supplies or fertilizer. Another real and horrifying use for lower-grade mummies. The journey is long. The smell emanating from the hold of that ship must have been unimaginable. When the ship arrives in Europe, the sacks of human remains are sold to the people who will do the final processing. Sometimes this was a chemical company. Sometimes it was a large-scale artist's color man. The mummy, once a person with a name and a life, has been reduced to a nameless, fragmented, fungible good. Its journey from sacred tomb to industrial grinder is almost complete. The supply chain was brutal, efficient, and almost entirely hidden from the final consumer. The artist in his sunlit studio, who just wanted a nice, reliable shade of brown, he opened a fresh tub of paint, smelling of linseed oil and myrrh. Blissfully unaware of the dynamite, the desecration, and the grim voyage that had brought it to him. The crates have arrived. They sit on the grimy floor of a workshop in a damp, industrial corner of London or Paris. The air here doesn't smell of salt and tar, but of chemical solvents, linseed oil, and a faint, musty, sweetish odor that you can't quite place. This is the final, and perhaps most unsettling, stage of the journey. This is where the human remains are transformed into an artist's pigment. Let's imagine you are an apprentice in one of these workshops, a place like the famed firm of Robertson Co. in London. Your master is the color man, a respected craftsman who supplies the greatest painters of the day. Your tasks are usually grinding lapis lazuli to make ultramarine or roasting sienna earth to change its color. But today, a new shipment has arrived from the docks. Your master hands you a crowbar and points to a large wooden crate stenciled with the word EGYPT. You pry open the lid. The smell intensifies. Inside, you don't see a regal, linen-wrapped pharaoh. The reality is far more grim and pathetic. The crate is filled with a jumble of dull, brittle fragments, disarticulated limbs, torsos, heads, all broken and compressed for shipping. Some still have scraps of linen clinging to them. Others are bare, blackened flesh and bone. This is not archaeology, this is butchery. Your first task is to sort the material. This is a known, if rarely discussed, part of the process. The best mummies, those that were more intact and clearly soaked in rich, dark bitumen, were set aside. These would become the highest quality mummy brown, prized for its transparency and deep color. The less promising looking pieces drier. More skeletal remains would be used for a lower grade, more opaque pigment, or perhaps sold off to be ground into fertilizer. Now comes the main event, the grinding. You take a piece of a mummy, perhaps the torso of a man who was a scribe in the court of Ramesses I, and you put it into a heavy-duty mill. This isn't the delicate stone slab and glass muller you'd use for precious minerals. This is an industrial piece of equipment, a machine designed to pulverize tough materials. You turn the crank, or perhaps flip a switch on a newer, steam-powered version. The machine groans to life, and a terrible, crunching, splintering sound fills the workshop as the ancient, desiccated body is broken down. Flesh, bone, resin, and scraps of linen are all pulverized together into a coarse, dark powder. The resulting material is then sifted. You scoop the powder into a large sieve to remove the larger, harder fragments of bone. This is a bizarrely specific detail mentioned in some old texts, the difficulty of getting all the bone fragments out. A poor quality mummy brown was often described as gritty, and that grittiness was literally powdered bone that hadn't been ground finely enough. After sifting, you are left with a pile of fine, brownish black dust. This is the raw pigment. It's still not paint. The final step is to mix it with a binder. You take the powder to the grinding slab, the same one used for more conventional pigments. You place a mound of the mummy dust on the stone, make a small well in the center, and pour in a measure of golden linseed oil. Then, using the glass mold, you begin the slow, methodical process of combining them. As you work the molar in slow, circular motions, the transformation happens. The dry, dusty powder absorbs the oil, turning into a thick, glossy, unctuous paste. The color deepens, becoming the rich, transparent brown that artists so desire. The musty smell of the dust is now mingled with the nutty scent of the oil. It looks, for all the world, like any other paint. You scrape the finished product from the slab with a palette knife and carefully pack it into a small pig's bladder, tying it off with a string. Or if your workshop is modern, you squeeze it into a tin tube, put a cap on it, and stick on a neat paper label mummy brown. Historians still debate the precise recipe and the chemical properties of this pigment. The exact composition, of course, varied wildly from one mummy to another. The presence of bitumen provided the color. But what did the other components do? Some modern scientific analysis suggests that the presence of ammonia and other breakdown products from the flesh might have affected the drying properties of the oil. The powdered bone, rich in calcium phosphate, could have acted as a sort of inert filler, giving the paint more body. It's a field of study called technical art history, and it seeks to understand paintings not just as images, but as physical objects with complex chemical histories. Here's a particularly strange tidbit that occasionally surfaces in the lore of color men: the question of fakes. Just as there were fake mummies sold in Egypt, there were almost certainly fake mummy brown pigments sold in Europe. A less than scrupulous color man, finding genuine mummies too expensive or too gruesome to handle, could have easily created a counterfeit. A bit of standard bitumen, some burnt umber, maybe a little ground-up animal bone for authenticity. Who would know the difference? The final consumer. The artist certainly wouldn't. This raises a fascinating and unanswerable question for museum conservators today when they analyze a painting and find a brown pigment that looks like mummy brown. How can they be sure it's the real thing and not a clever 19th century fake? As you finish your work for the day, you wipe your hands, which are stained with that peculiar brown. You've spent your day turning a human being into a consumer good. You've taken a sacred object, a piece of history, and processed it like a side of beef. You stack the finished tubes on a shelf, ready to be sold. Somewhere, an artist is waiting for this exact color to finish the shadows on his latest masterpiece, never once considering the crunching sound the world had to make to produce it. The final link in this bizarre chain is the most mundane and, in a way, the most surreal. After the tomb robbing, the back alley deals, the gruesome shipping, and the industrial grinding, Mummy Brown ends its journey in a quiet, respectable shop. It sits on a shelf, neatly packaged, waiting for a customer. The horror of its origin has been completely sanitized, transformed into a simple, commercial product. Let's put you in the shoes of a young, aspiring artist in London, sometime around 1880. You've saved up a bit of money and you're heading to the artist's Sculler Man to restock your paint box. Your destination is a legendary establishment, a place like Robertson Co., Unlawmaker, or Winsor Newton in Rathbone Place. These weren't dingy workshops, they were the equivalent of high-end specialty stores. You push open the door, and a small bell jingles. The interior is beautiful. The air smells wonderfully of linseed oil, turpentine, and wood varnish. Sunlight streams through the large front windows, illuminating shelves stacked high with goods. You see rolls of fine Belgian linen canvas, bundles of brushes with polished wood handles, and, most importantly, the paints. There are drawers and display cases filled with pigments, and there are clouded fawn, glittering like jewels in glass jars, the brilliant red of vermilion, the deep blue of cobalt, the sunny yellow of cadmium. But what you're here for is the modern convenience spree mixed oil paints in tubes. You walk over to the large wooden cabinet that houses them. It's a glorious sight, a rainbow of colors, each tube with a crisp paper label. You scan the names: Cerulean blue, Viridian green, Rose madder, Naples yellow, and there, nestled between burnt umber and raw sienna, you see it a tube labeled Mummy Brown. It's a standard product. The shopkeeper, a polite man in a waistcoat, might recommend it to you. The Mummy Brown, he might say. An excellent choice for glazes. Sir, very popular with the gentlemen at the Royal Academy. Has a lovely transparency that you just can't get with the earth browns. He treats it as just another color. And so do you. This is a well-documented fact. These major, reputable art supply companies openly produced and sold Mummy Brown for decades. We have their catalogs to prove it. I. Robertson Co. Catalog from the late 19th century, for example, lists Mummy Brown, a rich brown color, prepared from the fleshly parts of mummy. The description is starkly honest. Yet somehow, the clinical language makes it sound almost scientific and respectable. It's not ground up, people, it's a color prepared from the fleshly parts of mummy. You buy the tube. It costs a bit more than the umbers, a bit less than the cobaltess. You put it in your bag along with your other supplies and head back to your studio. You might not have given its name a second thought. Mummy is an exotic word. Turkey red isn't made from turkeys. And Prussian blue has nothing to do with the soldiers of the Prussian army. It was discovered by a color maker in Berlin. You might reasonably assume Mummy Brown is just a fanciful trade name for a pigment that mimics the color of Egyptian antiquities. But here's a little known detail about those tubes. The paint inside wasn't just mummy powder and oil. To make the paint shelf stable and give it the right consistency, color men often added other ingredients. The exact formulas were closely guarded trade secrets. Modern analysis of surviving tubes of Mummy Brown has revealed that some contained wax to prevent the oil from separating, and additional resins to improve the gloss. Some batches were also likely extended with cheaper pigments like burnt umber to stretch the expensive mummy material further. So the tube you bought might be 50% mummy, or it might be 10% mummy. You never really knew what you were getting. The academic debate here centers on the cessation of its production. For a long time, the story was that production stopped because artists found out the truth and were horrified. But the reality is more complex. While ethics certainly played a role for some, the decline of Mummy Brown was also driven by practical concerns. The supply of good mummies was dwindling as Egypt began to protect its heritage. More importantly, the quality was just too inconsistent. One tube might be perfect, the next gritty and poor drying. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the new, scientifically reliable synthetic iron oxide pigments like Mars Brown offered a stable, predictable, and cheaper alternative. Artists, being practical people, gradually switched to the more reliable product. So you get back to your studio. You unscrew the cap from your brand new tube of Mummy Brown. You squeeze a small worm at the dark, glossy paint onto your wooden palette. It looks beautiful next to the other colors. You pick up your brush, charge it with the paint, and turn to your canvas. You are about to paint the deep, mysterious shadows in a romantic forest scene, or perhaps the warm, soulful eyes of a portrait. You are an artist, a creator of beauty, and you are about to do it with a material born from an act of profound destruction. The long, dark journey is over. The mummy has found its final resting place, not in a tomb that would grant it eternal life, but as a thin, transparent layer on a work of art, destined to hang silently on a wall for centuries. You are no longer an apprentice or a middleman. You are now the end user. It's the 1880 seconds. And you are a painter. But you're not just any painter. You are part of a movement, a brotherhood that wants to revolutionize British art. You are a pre-Raphaelite. You and your friends artists like Dante Gabriel Rossetti, John Everett Millais, and William Holman Hunt are tired of the stuffy, academic art of the day. You find the paintings of Sir Joshua Reynolds and his followers to be dark, murky, and full of tired formulas. You want to create something new, something vibrant, honest, and full of intense emotion and detail. Your philosophy is to return to the art of the early Renaissance, to the time before the high Renaissance master Raphael, hence your name, the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. You believe in painting directly from nature, with brilliant, jewel-like colors and a near photographic attention to detail. You choose subjects from literature, poetry, Shakespeare, and the Bible stories filled with romance, tragedy, and moral lessons. To achieve your signature style, your technique is crucial. A key part of the Pre-Raphaelite method is to work on a white, wet ground. You apply a layer of wet white paint to the canvas and then paint your colors into it. This technique makes the colors incredibly luminous, as if they are lit from within. This is a well-known fact of their artistic practice. Every blade of grass, every thread in a tapestry, every strand of hair must be rendered with painstaking precision. Now, where does Mummy Brown fit into this vibrant, colorful world? It seems counterintuitive. Your palette is dominated by bright blues, vivid greens, and startling reds. But every painting needs shadow, every object needs form. And this is where the strange pigment becomes your secret weapon. Imagine you are in your studio, working on a large canvas. Your subject is a failure, from Shakespeare's Hamlet, floating in the river just before she drowns. You've painted the lush green foliage of the riverbank with incredible detail, the delicate white flowers of her dress, the pale skin of her face. Now you need to paint the water around her. The water needs to be dark and deep, but also transparent. You want to be able to suggest the murky depths and the trailing weeds beneath the surface. This is a job for glazers. A glaze is a thin, transparent layer of paint applied over a dried, lighter layer. It's like laying a sheet of colored glass over an image. This is where Mummy Brown excels. You squeeze a bit of it onto your palette. You mix it with a glazing medium, a blend of linseed oil, turpentine, and perhaps a resin varnish to make it even more fluid and transparent. Then, with a soft brush, you apply this thin, brownish film over the areas of the river. The effect is magical. The dark glaze settles into the texture of the canvas, defining the ripples in the water. It darkens the areas around Ophelia's body, making her seem to float in a deep, mysterious pool. But because the glaze is transparent, the greens and blues you painted underneath still glow through it, creating a sense of depth and complexity that an opaque brown, like a ronde, could never achieve. You use it to deepen the shadows in the folds of a velvet cloak, to add richness to the polished wood of a lute, or to create the warm, intimate darkness of an interior scene. It's the perfect tool for adding age, mystery, and solemnity to your hyper-detailed worlds. Here's a specific, if slightly apocryphal, anecdote. The French artist Martin de Rolling's 1817 painting, À l'intérieur d'une cuisine, the interior of a kitchen, became legendary in art circles. It was displayed in the Louvre and was admired for its incredible luminosity and deep, rich shadows. It was widely rumored that the secret to his beautiful, transparent browns was his liberal use of Mummy Brown. Aspiring artists, including many of the pre-Raphaelites and their contemporaries, flocked to see it and tried to replicate the effect. The painting became an advertisement for the pigment. However, there is an ongoing academic debate about which specific pre-Raphaelite artists used it, and how extensively, while its popularity in the era is undisputed, and many of their paintings exhibit the exact visual qualities of Mummy Brown. Definitive proof is often elusive. Written records are scarce. Did Rossetti use it for the flowing hair of his famously red-headed muses? Did Millais use it for the shadows in his dramatic narrative scenes without drilling a microscopic core sample from a multi-million-dollar painting and subjecting it to mass spectrometry, something museums are understandably reluctant to do? It's often a matter of educated guesswork based on visual characteristics and historical context. Conservators might note that a particular brown area has the specific type of cracking associated with the pigment, but they can rarely be 100% certain. You, as our pre-Raphaelite painter, are not thinking about any of this. You're thinking about beauty, about capturing a fleeting moment of tragic romance on your canvas. You love this pigment. It's part of your artistic arsenal. You might even feel a certain romantic attachment to its name. Mummy brown. It sounds ancient, mysterious, Gothic, perfectly in keeping with your artistic sensibilities. You are painting scenes from King Arthur and Dante Alighieri, so using a pigment with such a historical, almost mythical name feels appropriate. You have no idea that the myth is literal. The very tool you are using to create your romantic, idealized vision of the past is, in fact, a desecrated piece of the actual past. You are building your luminous, beautiful dream world out of the dust of the dead. Let's stay in your studio for a little longer. You've finished your glazing, and the effect is just as you hoped, deep, luminous, and mysterious. But as you work with this pigment day after day, you start to notice its peculiar eccentricities. Mummy brown is not a well-behaved, predictable servant like your other comers. It has a personality that's moody, temperamental, and sometimes downright frustrating. You're working on another section of the painting, perhaps the dark, with an interior of a room where a tragic heroine is reading a letter. You need a smooth, even layer of shadow. You squeeze out some mummy brown from that same tube you used yesterday. But today, for some reason, it feels different. It seems a little gritty. As you brush it onto the canvas, you can feel a slight drag. You look closer and see tiny, almost imperceptible specks in the paint film. You try to smooth them out, but they remain. It's infuriating. You might blame your brush, or the canvas, or even the air in the studio. You would never guess that you're struggling with prudy ground particles of human bone. This inconsistency is a well-documented technical issue with the pigment. Since every batch was made from a different mummy or collection of mummies, its properties were a complete lottery. 1-2. Made from a resin-rich, Ptolemaic body, might be smooth and transparent. The next, made from an older, more desiccated mummy from a drier tomb, might be coarse and less vibrant. Artists of the period frequently complained about the unreliability of their materials, and Mummy Brown was a prime offender. Now let's talk about another one of its quirks: drying time. All paints don't dry by evaporation, they dry by oxidation, a chemical reaction where the oil absorbs oxygen from the air and hardens. Different pigments can speed up or slow down this process. Mummy Brown was notoriously unpredictable in this regard. You paint a shadow one day and expect it to be dry to the touch in a week, but 2 weeks later, it's still tacky, or conversely, another batch might dry so quickly that it cracks on the canvas. Why? Modern science has some theories. The bitumen content would slow the drying, but the presence of other substances from the body salts, minerals, and who knows what else could either accelerate or further inhibit it. The artist using it was essentially conducting an uncontrolled chemical experiment on their own painting. Let's zoom in even closer on the canvas, to the microscopic level. You're looking at that beautiful, deep shadow you painted. To your eye, it looks perfect, but if we could look at it under a microscope decades later, we would see a disaster in the making. This is where Mummy Brown reveals its truly treacherous nature. The bitumen component, as we know, never fully polymerizes. It remains chemically active over the years. As the painting is exposed to light and changes in temperature and humidity, the Mummy Brown layer continues to move and change. It can shrink, causing a fine network of cracks, a phenomenon known as sericalcia. This isn't the gentle, Even cracking you see on an old master, which art historians love. This is a destructive, disfiguring cracking that can flake off, taking other layers of paint with it. It can also, bizarrely, sink in. The oil from the mummy brown layer can be absorbed by the layers underneath, leaving the pigment particles underbound and giving the area a dull, matte appearance that ruins the glossy, shadowy effect the artist intended. Conservators in museums today spend a great deal of time trying to remedy these problems, carefully applying varnish to resaturate these sunken areas and consolidating the flaking paint. There is a long-standing debate among art conservators about the MUMMIES problem. MUMMIES was a popular painting medium in the 18th and 19th centuries, a gel-like substance made from mastic resin and lead-laced linseed oil. It made paint easy to handle and gave it a lovely gloss. It was also, like bitumen, an unmitigated chemical catastrophe that caused horrific cracking and darkening over time. Many artists used MUMMIES with mummy brown, creating a perfect storm of unstable materials. The academic argument is when we see a 19th century painting with dark, crepe, alligator skies up in tools, is it the fault of the mummy brown, the MUMMIES, or the disastrous combination of the two? Untangling this chemical blame game is a huge challenge for modern conservation science. And here's one more peculiar phantom you might encounter in the studio. Let's say you're trying to paint a subtle transition, blending a patch of mummy brown into a lighter color, like a lid white or a Naples yellow. You mix them on your palette, but instead of a smooth, predictable light brown, you get a slightly streaky, curdled-looking mess. The two paints just don't want to play nicely together. Some conservators have theorized that the sheer chemical complexity of the mummy pigment, a chaotic mix of organic and inorganic materials, made it reactive with certain other pigments, particularly those containing lead or sulfur, causing them to behave strangely when mixed. So as you stand back and admire your work, you are blissfully unaware of the ticking time bomb you've just painted into your masterpiece. You love the pigment for its immediate visual reward, for the beautiful, soulful shadows it creates. You tolerate its frustrating inconsistencies because the payoff is worth it. But you have no idea that the ghost of the person in your paint is not just a poetic concept. It's a chemical reality, a restless presence that will continue to haunt your painting, to shift and crack and degrade it, long after you and your pre-Raphaelite brethren are gone. Despite its moody behavior and unpredictable nature, you and your fellow artists continue to use mummy brown. The visual effects are just too seductive to give up. The demand remains steady, but you're starting to notice something. It's getting harder to find the good stuff. The quality of the pigment seems to be declining year by year. You go to your trusted color man at Robertson Co. to buy a new tube. You mentioned that your last batch was a bit gritty and didn't have the same rich, warm tone you love. The shopkeeper might sigh and give you a knowing look. "Why yes, sir," he might say, "it's not what it used to be. The quality of the raw material from Egypt is becoming quite unreliable." Yes, not wrong. The pigment's biggest selling point, its unique composition, was also its greatest flaw. Mummy brown was an imperfect, finite, and wildly inconsistent material from the very beginning. Unlike a mineral pigment like ochre, which can be mined from a consistent geological seam, every single mummy was different. This is a well-established fact of its history. The final color and quality of the pigment depended on a morbid list of variables. The embalming method, a wealthy individual from the New Kingdom around 1550-1070 BC was likely embalmed using expensive, high-quality resins and bitumen. Their remains would produce a superior, transparent, and richly colored pigment. A person from the later Roman or Coptic periods might have been preserved with cheaper materials, or even just dried out with salt, resulting in a duller, less stable color. The condition of the body, how well was the mummy preserved? Was it kept in a dry, sealed tomb, or did it suffer from water damage and decay? Well-preserved mummy yielded better pigment. The adulterants would else got ground up with it the linen wrappings, which varied in quality and cleanliness, contributed to the final mixture. Sand, dirt, Another debris from the tomb floor often contaminated the source material, leading to that dreaded grittance you've been complaining about. You, the artist, are at the mercy of this ghoulish lottery. Buying a tube of mummy brown was like buying a bottle of wine from a winery that changed its grapes, its soil, and its fermentation process with every single bottle. You never knew what you were going to get. Now let's add another layer of imperfection. We've touched on the cracking and darkening caused by the bitumen. This was the pigment's most infamous flaw. Artists would see their beautiful, deep shadows slowly transform over the decades into a cracked, ugly mess. By famous story, though perhaps embellished, tells of one artist who painted a portrait of a family member. He used mummy brown for the rich, dark background. Years later, he was horrified to see the background had developed deep fissures and had darkened so much that the subject's head seemed to be floating in a sea of black tar. Here's a specific technical flaw that drove painters crazy: its effect on other colors. Because of its oily, resinous nature, mummy brown could cause bleeding. You might carefully paint a light-colored area right next to a shadow you've rendered in mummy brown. A year later, you notice a faint, brownish halo has leached from the dark area into the light area, staining it and ruining your crisp edge. It was a fugitive pigment not just in terms of its own stability, but in its refusal to stay put on the canvas. The academic debate here revolves around a simple question: how much of this was understood at the time? Did 19th century artists and color men know about the long-term instability of bitumen? By extension, mummy brown? The answer is a qualified yes. The problems with bitumen-based paints like asphalt were known and discussed since the 18th century. Manuals on painting technique warned against their overuse. So why did artists keep using mummy brown? This is where the debate lies. Some historians argue that artists were simply ignorant or chose to ignore the warnings, seduced by the immediate, beautiful effects. Others argue that they believed mummy brown was a tamed or improved version of bitumen. They may have thought, as we speculated earlier, that the addition of the ground-up body somehow stabilized the volatile tar. This was a form of magical thinking, a hope that this mysterious, ancient substance would be exempt from the mundane laws of chemistry. They were, of course, wrong. The greatest imperfection of all, however, was a moral one, even if most of its users were not yet aware of it. But the whispers were starting. The world was changing. Archaeology was professionalizing. The idea of digging up ancient bodies for commercial use was beginning to shift from a grand adventure to something that felt a little distasteful. The supply chain was being squeezed not just by a lack of quality mummies, but by a slowly dawning sense of ethical unease. The pigment was imperfect chemically, and it was becoming imperfect culturally. Its time was running out. But before it vanished completely, its terrible secret was about to be revealed to the artistic community in a very dramatic and personal way. The year is now somewhere in the late 1880s or 1890s. The pre-Raphaelite movement is no longer the revolutionary force it once was. It has become the establishment. You are one of its leading figures. A respected, successful artist named Edward Burne-Jones. You are famous for your dreamy, romantic paintings of Arthurian legends on classical myths. Your studio is a sanctuary of beauty, filled with magnificent tapestries, intricate drawings, and canvases that glow with your signature melancholic and ethereal style. Like many of your contemporaries, you have a favorite brown pigment. You love its transparency, its roll, and the way it allows you to build up deep, soulful shadows. It's a staple on your palette. You know it by its exotic trade name mummy brown. To you, it's just a name, a historical curiosity. You've probably never given its literal meaning a moment's thought. One afternoon, you are hosting some friends for tea in your studio. Among them is a fellow artist, and perhaps your brother-in-law, a man named Lawrence Armatidema. Armatidema is also a titan of the Victorian art world, famous for his incredibly detailed and archaeologically precise paintings of life in ancient Rome, Greece, and, significantly, Egypt. He is a meticulous researcher. While you paint the world of myth and dream, he paints the world of historical reality. The conversation flows, as it often does, to the tools of the trade. You might be lamenting the poor quality of a recent batch of cobalt blue, or praising a new type of brush. Then, you gesture to your palette, perhaps pointing out the lovely brown you're using for the shadows in your current masterpiece. I'm having a bit of luck with this mummy brown, you might say. The last tube was dreadful, but this one is superb. Ometidima stops, his teacup halfway to his lips. He looks at you with an expression of mild surprise that quickly turns to horror. Good heavens, Burne-Jones, he says. Don't you know what that is? You confess you don't. You assume it's some sort of bitumen or asphaltum from Egypt, perhaps collected near the ancient tombs. No, Ometidima replies, his voice dropping. He then proceeds to tell you. He explains, in his precise, scholarly way, that the pigment is not from a mummy, or found near a mummy. It is the mummy. He describes the entire gruesome process that desecrated tombs, the bodies ground to dust, the workshops in London. He tells you that the beautiful, warm brown color you so admire is derived from the flesh and bones of a human being who lived and died thousands of years ago. A stunned silence falls over the studio. The romantic, Gothic name has suddenly become a grotesque, literal reality. The tool you have been using to create scenes of ethereal beauty is, in fact, an object of desecration. The ghost in the machine is real. This story, centered on Edward Burne-Jones, is one of the most famous anecdotes in the history of pigments. It is a cornerstone of the mummy brown legend. According to the tale, passed down through the Burne-Jones family, the artist was so profoundly shocked and horrified by this revelation that he immediately left his guests, picked up the tube of mummy brown from his paint box, and walked with grim purpose out into his garden. There, with the solemnity of a state funeral, he dug a small hole in the soft earth and buried the tube of paint. He vowed never to use the color again. This is the popular, dramatic version of the story. But how true is it? Historians and art biographers are still in a gentle debate about the exact details. The core of the story that Burne-Jones was horrified and gave the pigment a ceremonial burial is generally accepted and comes from his wife Georgiana's memoirs and the memoirs of his studio assistant. However, the precise timing and the identity of the person who told him are subjects of discussion. Was it really Ometidima over tea, or did he learn it from another source? Did the funeral happen exactly as described? Or is it a slightly romanticized family legend? Furthermore, there's the question of plausibility. Could a man as educated and well-connected as Burne-Jones truly have been ignorant of the pigment's origin for so long? Some argue it's unlikely, given that the information was available in color men's catalogues. Others argue that it's entirely plausible. Artists were focused on their craft, not on the industrial origins of their materials. The name was strange, but not so strange as to automatically trigger a literal interpretation in an era full of fanciful trade names. The little-known fact here is the ripple effect. Burne-Jones was an incredibly influential artist. When a painter of his stature renounces a pigment on moral grounds, people take notice. The story of the funeral for the tube of paint likely spread through the London art scene. It forced other artists to confront the same horrifying reality. Could you, in good conscience, continue to use a pigment made from a human body once you knew the truth for many? The answer was no. This moment represents a crucial turning point. The decline of mummy brown was no longer just about its technical flaws or a dwindling supply. It now had a powerful ethical dimension. The abstract horror of its production was suddenly personalized through the story of a beloved artist's disgust. The pigment was becoming taboo. You couldn't just casually ask for it from your color man anymore without feeling a pang of guilt. The ghost was out of the bottle rather. The tube, and it could not be put back in. The funeral in the garden wasn't just the end of one tube of paint, it was the beginning of the end for the pigment itself. The story of Edward Burne-Jones and his garden funeral sends a chill through the art world. It transforms the pigment from a technical curiosity into a moral dilemma. Suddenly, you're not just an art lover anymore, you're a detective, haunted by a new and unsettling question. As you walk through the galleries of a museum, your eyes are drawn to the shadows. You lean in close to a grand history painting, not to admire the brushwork, but to interrogate the browns. You find yourself whispering, if Burne-Jones used it, who else? This question throws open a Pandora's box of speculation that art historians are still trying to close. The list of confirmed users is actually quite short. The list of suspected users, however, is vast and includes some of the biggest names of the 19th century. The main suspects are often the French Romantic painters, artists like Theo Géricault and Eugène Delacroix. This is a major point of art historical discussion. Think about their work. They were obsessed with drama, emotion, and exoticism. Delacroix's paintings are full of swirling, passionate energy, violent historical scenes, and sensual depictions of North Africa. His canvases, like the death of Sardaigne Palace, are a riot of color and deep, velvety shadows. His technique often involved the heavy use of glazes and bitumen-rich paints to achieve that dramatic chiaroscuro. Mummy Brown, with its name, its origin, and its visual properties, would have been almost poetically perfect for him. Imagine you are standing in the Louvre in front of Delacroix's masterpiece, Liberty Leading the Peoples. You look past the heroic figure of Liberty and into the smoke-filled, shadowy background. You see the deep, warm browns used to model the fallen figures in the foreground in the dark recesses of the Parisian barricade. The color has that signature transparency, that slight reddish glow. It feels like Mummy Brown. Delacroix traveled to North Africa. He was fascinated by the Orient. He was certainly not a man to shy away from a pigment with a dramatic backstory. Did he use it? It seems incredibly likely. But there is no diary entry, no letter, no signed confession from the artist saying, "Today, I painted the shadows of revolution with the dust of an ancient Egyptian." And this is the heart of the academic debate. How do you prove it in the absence of written proof from the artist? You are left with two options. The first is, can Noyes shoot the trained eye of an expert who can look at a paint layer and say, based on the color, the transparency, and the specific way it has cracked over time, this is consistent with Mummy Brown. This is an educated guess. The compelling one, perhaps, but still a guess. The second option is science. Modern conservation labs can take a microscopic sample of the paint, or coarse sample smaller than the period at the end of the sentence, and analyze it using techniques like gas chromatography, mass spectrometry. This can identify the specific organic molecules of bitumen, resins, and, crucially, the chemical markers of human protein or DNA. This is the only way to get a definitive yes. But museums are, for obvious reasons, extremely hesitant to allow even minor destructive testing on their masterpieces. So for most paintings, the question remains tantalizingly unanswered. We are left to stare at the canvas and wonder. Now for a truly strange and lesser-known part of this puzzle. We focused on artists who used it in ignorance, like Burne-Jones, or who might have used it for practical reasons, like Delacroix. But what if there were artists who knew exactly what it was, and used it because of what it was? The late 19th century was also the era of the symbolist movement, a group of artists who rejected realism in favor of dreams, mysticism, and the morbid. They were fascinated by the occult, by death, by the strange and the grotesque. It is entirely plausible, though very hard to prove, that a symbolist painter might have sought out Mummy Brown precisely for its horrific origin. Imagine a reclusive painter in his Paris studio, a man obsessed with Edgar Allan Poe. For him, painting a scene of a haunting or a tragic death with a pigment made from a human corpse wouldn't be horrifying, it would be a profound artistic statement. It would be a form of magic, infusing the canvas with a literal aura of death and history. While the pre-Raphaelites used it to create beauty despite its origins, a symbolist might have used it to create beauty from its origins. This theory remains speculative, a whisper in the footnotes of art history, because these artists would have had no reason to advertise their ghoulish secret. So, the search continues. Every few years, a new scientific study is published. A museum in a smaller city might agree to test a lesser-known painting from the era, and the results will add one more name to the list. A painting by the American artist John Goff Rand, the inventor of the tin paint too, has been tested and found to contain it. But the major works, the icons of the 19th century, remain shrouded in mystery. We may never know for sure if the shadows on some of our most beloved paintings are just a mixture of oil and earth, or if they hold a much darker, more ancient secret. The supply of potential evidence is vast, but the means of confirming it are limited. Meanwhile, another force was at work that would make this entire debate moot. The supply itself, the river of mummies that had flowed into Europe for centuries, was finally beginning to run dry. The moral outcry started by artists like Burne-Jones was one powerful force pushing mummy brown towards extinction. But at the same time, a far more practical and immovable force was at work. Thousands of miles away, on the banks of the Nile, the source was being shut off. The seemingly endless supply of ancient bodies that had fueled European medicine, entertainment, and art for centuries was finally being exhausted. More importantly, protected. Let's shift your perspective one last time. You are no longer in a European studio or museum. You are an archaeologist in Egypt in the early 20th century, maybe around 1910. The world you work in is vastly different from the one Napoleon's savants encountered a century earlier. The era of freelance treasure hunting on industrial scale tomb raiding is coming to an end. The primary reason for this is political. Egypt, while still under heavy British influence, had begun to establish its own national identity and a sense of ownership over its past. A key development was the establishment of the Egyptian Antiquities Service in 1858, founded by the French archaeologist Auguste Mariette. Its mission was to control and professionalize archaeology in Egypt, to stop the rampant looting, and to keep the most important discoveries within the country. This is a well-known chapter in the history of Egyptology. Mariette was a force of nature. He battled foreign diplomats, healers, and looters to establish a new principle: Egypt's heritage belonged to Egypt. He founded the first Egyptian museum in Cairo to house the treasures that were being unearthed. For the first time, there was a legal and institutional framework dedicated to stopping the flow of antiquities and mummies out of the country. You, as our early 20th century archaeologist, have to play by these new rules. You can't just show up with a pickaxe and start digging. You need a permit. You have to document your findings meticulously, and any significant artifacts you discover, especially royal mummies or important funerary objects, are destined for the Cairo Museum, not for a private collection or a colour man's workshop in London. The impact on the mummy market was slow but decisive. The casual, bulk trade, the kind that filled crates with jumbled body parts, was the first to go. It became much harder and riskier to smuggle human remains out of the country on that scale. The supply chain that had been so brutally efficient in the 1840s was now constricted. But there was another, more finite reason for the shortage. They were simply running out of easily accessible mummies. For centuries, tomb robbers had plundered the most obvious unreachable necropolises. The great cemeteries of Saqqara and Thebes had been systematically ransacked. The mummy mines were becoming depleted. Finding new, untouched tombs now required more scientific knowledge, more resources, and a lot more luck. The low-hanging fruit had all been picked, ground up, and painted onto a canvas. Here's a lesser-known aspect of this dwindling supply: the quality plummeted even further. As the prime, well-preserved mummies became rare, the dealers and looters who were still in business turned to more desperate sources. They scavenged fragmentary remains from already plundered tombs or passed off poorly preserved bodies from much later periods. An artist colour man in London trying to source raw material in 1910 would have received a product far inferior to what his grandfather had worked with in 1850. The pigment, already notoriously inconsistent, became almost unusable. There is a subtle academic debate here about the primary driver of Mummy Brown's demise. Was it the ethical awakening of the artists? as symbolized by the Burne-Jones story, or was it these purely practical, logistical factors, the new antiquities laws and the depletion of the source material? Some art historians emphasize the moral outrage, seeing it as a story of artistic conscience. Others, particularly archaeologists and economic historians, argue that the market simply collapsed due to supply chain failure. The truth is likely that both factors worked in concert. The artists' disgust grew just as the pigment was becoming harder to source and lower in quality, making the decision to abandon it much easier. So you stand there in the Egyptian sun, carefully brushing sand from a newly discovered coffin. The body inside is not a potential commodity. It is a scientific specimen. It is a human being with a history that you are trying to piece together. You are part of a new generation that sees the mummy not as a raw material for paint, fertilizer, or medicine, but as a source of knowledge, a fragile link to a lost world that deserves respect and preservation. Back in London, the effect is being felt directly. The colour man tells his customers that he can no longer guarantee the quality of his mummy brown. In fact, he's having trouble getting any at all. The price goes up, the reliability goes down. Artists, who were already growing squeamish about its origins and frustrated with its technical flaws, now have another, very practical reason to stop using it. They switch to the new, stable, and ethically uncomplicated synthetic browns that chemical companies are producing. The strange, dark river that flowed from the Nile to the Thames was slowing to a trickle. It was about to dry up completely, in a final, definitive moment that would pass into legend. The years roll by. The First World War reshapes the globe, and the art world is transformed along with it. The romantic, detailed style of the pre-Raphaelites and their contemporaries feels like a relic from another age. Modernism has arrived. Artists are now experimenting with cubism, futurism, and pure abstraction. Their concerns are with form, line, and draw, expressive color, not with creating luminous, transparent shadows in a mythical forest. The demand for finicky, old-fashioned pigment like mummy brown has all but vanished. The art supply shops that once proudly advertised it have quietly dropped it from their catalogues. The workshops that once ground up human remains have been repurposed or have shut down. The pigment fades from use, becoming little more than a historical curiosity, a grim footnote in the story of art. Most people assume it has been gone for decades. And then comes the final, definitive end. The story is so perfect, it feels like it must be fiction, but it is a widely reported and generally accepted piece of art world lore. The scene is the London office of C. Robert Co., the very same prestigious colourman's firm that had been a major supplier of the pigment for over a century. The year is 1964. You are the managing director of the company. The firm has a long and storied history, but you are now running a modern business. One day, you're taking inventory of the old storerooms, clearing out materials that haven't been touched in years. In a dusty corner of the warehouse, behind barrels of dried up varnish and forgotten pigments, your workers find it. A single, solitary, whole Egyptian mummy. It's the last one. A forgotten remnant from a shipment that arrived decades ago, back when the trade was still active. It has been sitting here in the London gloom, silently waiting, while the world outside changed beyond recognition for the current employees of Robert & Co. It's a shocking and slightly horrifying discovery. They are modern paint makers, men of science and chemistry. They are not in the business of grinding up people. The managing director is now faced with a dilemma. What on earth do you do with a mummy in 1960 for the pigment itself is obsolete? There is no commercial reason to process it, morally and legally. The idea is unthinkable. He can't sell it. He can't just throw it away. He is the reluctant custodian of the company's last, and most gruesome, secret. This moment becomes a famous historical anecdote. The director of Robertson's, so the story goes, made a formal announcement. He declared that they had finally run out of mummies. After more than 150 years, the company could no longer produce mummy brown because they had used up their very last one. A small, quirky detail of this story is the reaction it supposedly caused. A few eccentric, elderly artists, upon hearing the news, were said to have called the company in a panic, asking if they could purchase one last tube for old time's sake. The requests were, of course, politely denied. This announcement in 1964 is often cited as the official death of the pigment. It's a clean, memorable endpoint. But is the story entirely true? This is where the academic debate comes in. While the core of the anecdote, the discovery of the last mummy and the company's decision to stop production, is generally accepted as fact, some historians question the theatricality of the announcement. Did the director really make a grand public declaration? Or was it more of an internal company decision that later became a famous story, passed down and polished by journalists and art historians? Did they really run out? Or did they just finally decide to get rid of the last one they had? Furthermore, there's the question of what happened to that final mummy. The legend doesn't provide a clear answer. Unlike Burne-Jones's Tubov paint, this wasn't something you could just bury in the garden. The most credible accounts suggest that the company, wanting to do the right thing, made arrangements for the mummy to be properly and respectfully interred. It was given a formal burial, finally laid to rest after its long, strange sojourn in a paintmaker's warehouse. Its journey, which began in an ancient Egyptian tomb, had ended in a modern English cemetery. This moment in 1964 serves as a powerful bookend to the entire story. It marks the final, definitive collision between a 19th century practice and 20th century sensibilities. What was once an industrial commodity had become, in the eyes of the modern world, an undeniable human being. The managing director of Robinson's wasn't looking at a barrel of raw material, he was looking at a person. And he acted accordingly. The ghost had finally been laid to rest. The supply was not just dwindling anymore, it was officially, definitively gone. The pigment was now extinct. But even as the last mummy was buried, a new kind of replacement was already on the shelves of every art store. A product of the very modern chemistry that had made mummy brown obsolete in the first place. With the last mummy buried and the old supply chain gone forever, the world of art needed a new brown. Or rather, it needed to fully embrace the browns that had already been rendering mummy brown obsolete for decades. The solution didn't come from a desecrated to more a murky historical misunderstanding. It came from the laboratory. The replacement for the most morbid of pigments was the most rational synthetic iron oxides. Let's step back into your artist's smoke. It's the early 20th century. You've heard the disturbing rumors about mummy brown, and you're also fed up with its unreliability. You go to your art supply store, and the shopkeeper shows you a new range of colors. They have names that sound industrial and scientific, not romantic and gothic. He shows you a tube labeled Mars Brown. Mars, in this context, has nothing to do with the planet. It's the old alchemical name for iron. Mars Brown is an artificial iron oxide, a pigment created through chemical precipitation. This is the mainstream historical development that truly ended the age of macabre pigments. Chemists had figured out how to create high-purity iron oxides in a wide range of colors: yellows, reds, and, crucially, browns by controlling the chemical process. You squeeze a bit of Mars Brown onto your palette next to your dwindling, precious Tubov mummy brown. The difference is immediately apparent. The Mars Brown is perfectly smooth, with no hint of grittins. Its color is dense, rich, and completely uniform. You mix it with a little white. It creates a clean, predictable tint. You mix it with your glazing medium. It creates a transparent glaze that is just as beautiful as mummy brown, but without any of the underlying weirdness. This is a revolution for you as a painter. For the first time, you have a brown you can trust. Every tube of Mars Brown you buy will be identical to the last. It will dry at a predictable rate. It won't have a chemical argument with the other colors on your palette. It won't bleed into adjacent colors. And most importantly, it won't slowly destroy your painting with cracks and fissures over the next 50 years. It is stable, reliable, permanent, and, best of all, Its origins are completely non-gruesome. Here's a little-known fact that highlights the shift in thinking. The new synthetic pigments were often marketed on the basis of their scientific purity and permanence. Art supply catalogs from the early 20th century are filled with descriptions that boast about a pigment's light fastness, its resistance to fading, and its chemical inertness. This was a new way of selling color. The old pigments were sold on the basis of their exotic origins and historical prestige, like ultramarine from lapis lazuli or carmine from cochineal beetles. The new pigments were sold on the basis of their scientific reliability. The romance was gone, replaced by the certainty of industrial chemistry. Of course, not everyone was thrilled. There is always a debate when a new technology replaces an old one. Some traditionalist artists at the time likely grumbled about the new synthetic colors. They might have felt they were soulless or lacked character compared to the old, hand-ground pigments. Was there a certain unique visual quality to the chaotic mix of resin, bitumen, and organic matter in mummy brown that a pure, sterile iron oxide could never truly replicate? This is a subtle but persistent debate among artists and conservators. Some argue that the very imperfections of mummy brown, its slight variations in color, its unique way of refracting light through its transparent layers, gave it a visual quality that is impossible to reproduce exactly. They might argue that the synthetic replacements are too perfect, too uniform. Others argue this is just romantic nostalgia, and that a stable, predictable pigment is always superior for an artist's long-term intentions. You can't create a lasting work of art with a material that is actively trying to self-destruct. The transition was gradual but inevitable. As the 20th century progressed, the range of synthetic browns exploded. Today, you can walk into an art store and find dozens of them: burnt sienna hue, raw umber hue, the hue often indicating a synthetic version, and a whole family of transparent iron oxides like transparent red iron oxide and transparent yellow iron oxide, which can be mixed to create a perfect, stable, and completely mummy-free alternative to the old pigment. This shift represents a fundamental change in the relationship between the artist and their materials. For thousands of years, artists were at the mercy of geology and biology. Their colors came from crushed rocks, dried plants, and ground-up insects, and, for a time, people. They had to be experts in the strange and often frustrating properties of these natural substances. The rise of synthetic pigments freed the artist from these constraints. It gave them a level of control and predictability that a pre-Raphaelite painter could only have dreamed of. The beautiful, haunting brown you see in a modern painting is no longer a ghost. It's a testament to the power of chemistry to provide a more ethical, more reliable, and more humane solution. The shadows in art are no longer haunted by a dark secret. The tubes of mummy brown are gone from the shelves. The last mummy has been buried. The artists have all switched to their stable, synthetic Mars browns. It seems like the story is over. A bizarre and thankfully concluded chapter in the history of art. But it's not. The ghosts of this practice haven't been fully exorcised. They still linger, silently, in the gilded frames and climate-controlled galleries of our most respected museums. The shadow of mummy brown still falls over art history, forcing us to ask uncomfortable questions about the masterpieces we love. You're back in the museum, standing once again in front of that 19th century painting, The Enchanted Sleep. But you're not the same person you were at the beginning of this journey. You can't look at it in the same way. Before, you saw a beautiful, romantic scene. You admired the artist's skill, the composition, the use of light. Now, you see a crime scene. Your eyes are immediately drawn to the shadows. That deep, warm brown that once seemed so beautiful and atmospheric now looks sinister. You can't help but think about the journey that pigment took to get here. You see the blasted open tomb, the jumbled bodies in the crate, the crunching sound of the grinder in the London workshop. The sleeping princess in the painting seems doubly tragic now, her slumbering form shaded with the physical remains of someone else whose eternal rest was so brutally disturbed. This is the permanent, lingering legacy of Mummy Brown. It fundamentally changes our relationship with any artwork suspected of containing it. A known fact of museum practice is that conservators and curators are acutely aware of this issue. They have inventories and scientific analyses that often point to the presence of the pigment in certain works. This knowledge creates a quiet, behind-the-scenes ethical dilemma that the public rarely sees. A painting is no longer just a painting. If it contains mummy brown, it is also, technically, a human grave. It contains human remains. This places it in a strange and troubling category, alongside ancient reliquaries or archaeological displays. It complicates everything. How do you conserve it? How do you display it? How do you talk about it? Imagine a conservator working on the painting. They are meticulously cleaning the surface, removing a century's worth of discolored varnish. When their swab touches an area of shadow, are they just cleaning paint? Or are they disturbing a human body? It adds a layer of psychological weight to an already delicate job. And here's a specific, modern problem that this creates: the issue of repatriation and the treatment of human remains. In the 21st century, there is a powerful global movement, particularly led by indigenous communities, to have ancestral remains returned from museum collections to their native lands for proper burial. This is a major, ongoing debate in the museum world. So what about the human remains scattered invisibly across the canvases of European art? This is a point of academic and ethical discussion, though it's often more of a thought experiment than a practical proposal. Can a country like Egypt lay microscopic particles of its long-dead citizens that are now embedded in a priceless work of art hanging in the Louvre or the Tate Britain? Could they demand the repatriation of a painting? It sounds absurd. Undoubtedly, it would be a nightmare, but the underlying ethical question is real. It forces us to confront the fact that the cultural treasures of one nation were built, in some cases literally, from the human bodies of another. This legacy forces us to look at the entire era of Egyptomania with a more critical eye. We can no longer see it as a charming, eccentric fad. We see it as the cultural alarm of imperialism. The obsession with Egypt wasn't just about appreciation, it was about possession, consumption, and a fundamental lack of respect for non-European culture, and it did. The mummy unwrapping parties ceased to be quirky social events and become public acts of desecration. The scientific expeditions become intellectual plunder. The painting on the wall is a silent witness to this history. It's a beautiful object born from a brutal process. It's a testament to the artist's skill, but also to the era's profound ethical blind spots. It reminds us that the creation of beauty can sometimes have an ugly backstory, and that the materials we use are never truly neutral. They carry a history with them. We, the viewers, are now burdened with this knowledge. We are the ones who have to reconcile the painting's aesthetic beauty with its morbid reality. The artist may have been ignorant, but we are not, and that knowledge changes everything. The shadow in the painting is no longer just a patch of dark paint. It's a permanent stain on the canvas of history. The weight of this knowledge isn't just on you, the viewer. It falls most heavily on the shoulders of the people who are the modern-day keepers of these objects. Let's put you in their shoes. You are now a curator at a major art museum in the 21st century. You are in charge of the 19th century European art collection. Your job is a delicate balance of preserving art, researching its history, and presenting it to the public in a way that is engaging and educational. One day, your museum's conservation science department sends you a new report. They have been conducting non-invasive analysis, perhaps using a technique like X-ray fluorescence on some of your key paintings. The report confirms a long-held suspicion your museum's beloved masterpiece, The Night's Vigil, by a famous pre-Raphaelite artist, contains significant amounts of mummy brown in its shadowy passages. Now you have a problem, not a conservation problem. The painting is stable for now. You have a curatorial problem, an ethical problem. You are the official custodian of an artwork that contains human remains. What do you do? Your first dilemma is the label on the wall, the little brass plate. For decades, it has read The Night's Vigil, Celine de Batsuo, artist's name. Oil on canvas, simple, factual. Do you have a responsibility to change it should the new label red oil and ground human remains on canvas? This is a real and ongoing debate within the museum world. On one hand, intellectual honesty and transparency seem to demand it. The public has a right to know the full story of the objects they are viewing. Hiding the truth feels like complicity in the historical crime. It sanitizes a disturbing history and perpetuates the 19th century's ethical blindness. On the other hand, would such a label sensationalize the artwork? Would visitors be able to see the painting as a work of art anymore? Or would it just become a macabre freak show? Would the painting made of people become its only identity, overshadowing the artist's skill, the painting's historical context, and its aesthetic beauty? You worry about turning a subtle masterpiece into a blunt instrument of shock value. Then there's the question of the display itself. In many museums, there are strict ethical guidelines regarding the display of human remains. This is particularly true for ancestral remains from indigenous cultures. These guidelines often require that such remains be displayed with special dignity, in a separate, clearly marked area, with warnings for visitors who may find them distressing. Does the night's vigil now fall under these guidelines? Should you move it out of the main 19th century gallery and into a special exhibit about controversial materials? Doing so would rip it from its art historical context, isolating it from the very paintings it was in dialogue with. But leaving it where it is feels like you're not giving the human remains within it the respect they are due. Here's a lesser known but very real curatorial challenge: loans and exhibitions. You get a request from a museum in Japan for a major exhibition on pre-Raphaelite art. They want to borrow the night's vigil. It's your museum's star painting. But now you have to inform the borrowing institution that the artwork contains human remains. Different countries have different laws and cultural sensitivities about this. The Japanese museum might refuse the loan, citing cultural or ethical objections. Your masterpiece, a cultural ambassador for your museum, has suddenly become a biohazard, a piece of diplomatic baggage. The academic debate among modern curators and museum ethicists is fierce on this topic. There is no single, universally accepted answer. Some argue for full, unflinching transparency. They advocate for updated labels, dedicated web content, and public programming that confronts the issue head-on. They believe the museum's role is to educate, even when the truth is uncomfortable. Others argue for a more nuanced approach. They suggest that the information should be available to those who seek it in catalogs, online databases, or scholarly articles, but not necessarily plastered on the wall next to the painting. They fear that foregrounding the morbid aspect prevents viewers from having a primary aesthetic experience with the art, which is also a core part of the museum's mission. They argue that the artist's intent was to create a shadow, not to display a corpse. As the curator, you have to navigate this minefield. Every decision is fraught with meaning. You decide to start small. You organize a lecture series called The Secret Lives of Pigments. You write a long, detailed essay about Mummy Brown for the museum's website, linked via a QR code on the painting's label. You're trying to provide context without sensationalism, but you know it's an imperfect solution. The ghost in the painting is now your professional responsibility. It haunts your gallery talks, your budget meetings, and your long-term exhibition planning. You are the caretaker of a story that is still unfolding, a story that forces your institution, and the entire art world, to continually examine its past and question the price of beauty. The curatorial dilemma is real, but it all hinges on one crucial question: how do we know for sure your decision to relabel the night's vigil is based on that report from the conservation lab? But how did the scientists in the lab arrive at their conclusion? Censorship and old catalogs can create strong suspicions. But in the 21st century, museums and art historians want definitive proof. To get it, we have to leave the quiet gallery and enter the sterile, high-tech environment of the modern conservation laboratory. Imagine you are a conservation scientist. You are a unique blend of chemist, physicist, and art historian. Your job is to understand artworks as physical objects. Today, you are tasked with analyzing the brown paint in a shadowy passage of a 19th century painting. The curator suspects it's mummy brown, but they need confirmation. Your first step is non-invasive. You can't just scrape a sample of a priceless masterpiece. You might start with a technique called X-ray fluorescence XRF. You use a handheld device that looks a bit like a price scanner and point it at the brown paint. It bombards the area with X-rays, causing the elements in the paint to fluoresce, or emit their uncharacteristic X-rays. A detector reads these emissions and tells you what elements are present. If you find a lot of iron, it's likely a standard earth brown. If you find a lot of calcium and phosphorus, the key components of bone, your suspicions about mummy brown grow stronger. But this isn't definitive proof. Bitumen, another brown pigment, is an organic substance and won't show up clearly, and some other pigments might also contain calcium. To get closer to the truth, you need an actual sample. This is a painstaking, unnerve-wracking process. Under a high-powered microscope, you find a microscopic crack in the paint layer, a spot where a tiny flake is already loose. Using a scalpel with a tip finer than a human hair, you carefully lift a single, microscopic particle of paint, a sample so small it's barely visible to the naked eye. This is a well-established, though rare, practice in conservation science. You take this tiny speck and embed it in a clear polyester resin, creating a tiny cube. Then you polish the cube down, creating a perfect cross-section of the paint layers: the varnish, the brown layer, the white ground, all stacked like geological strata. Now the real forensic work begins. You might place this cross-section into a scanning electron microscope (PCM) equipped with an energy dispersive X-ray EDX detector. This is like the XRF analysis but on a microscopic, much more powerful scale. It can give you a detailed elemental map of each individual paint layer. Again, you're looking for that telltale signature of calcium and phosphorus. But now you can see exactly which layer it's in. But the real smoking gun for mummy brown is the organic material, the bitumen, and, most importantly, the proteins from the human tissue. To find these, you need even more advanced techniques. You need to identify molecules, not just elements. You might use a technique like Fourier transform infrared spectroscopy (FTIR), which shines infrared light on the sample. Different molecular bonds absorb the light at different frequencies, creating a unique spectral fingerprint. Your goal is to find the fingerprints for bitumen and, if you're lucky, for the amide bonds that are characteristic of proteins. This is where a significant academic debate lies among conservation scientists. How can you definitively prove the presence of human remains? Identifying bitumen is relatively straightforward, but identifying the proteins is incredibly difficult. After thousands of years entombed, then another century and a half suspended in oil paint, the proteins are extremely degraded. Furthermore, the oil binder of the paint is also a complex organic substance that can interfere with the results. Can you be sure the protein signature you're seeing isn't just from the binder or a contaminant? To get the most definitive answer possible, you turn to the ultimate tool: gas chromatography, mass spectrometry (GCMS). This is a two-step process. First, you break down the organic molecules in your tiny sample. Then you vaporize them and send them through a long, coiled gas chromatography, which separates the different molecules based on their size and chemical properties. As each molecule exits the tube, it enters the mass spectrometer, which zaps it with an electron beam, breaking it into charged fragments. The machine then measures the mass of these fragments, creating a unique fragmentation pattern for each molecule. By analyzing these patterns, you can identify the specific biomarkers for bitumen, and, in a few groundbreaking studies, scientists have been able to identify the breakdown products of cholesterol and specific amino acids that are more indicative of animal-human tissue than of plant-based oils. When you find high levels of bitumen in the chemical markers for bone and the degraded protein lipid signature, you can finally say with a high degree of scientific certainty this is mummy brown. This level of analysis is complex, expensive, and still evolving. But it's changing the game for art history. It's turning educated guesses into established facts, allowing curators to make informed decisions and helping us to understand the true hidden material history of the art we cherish. The ghost in the painting is being put under the microscope. The story so far has been relentlessly, morbidly human. We've followed the journey of human bodies from tomb to tomb. But the vast, industrial-scale desecration of ancient Egypt for commercial purposes wasn't limited to people. As our scientific tools get more sophisticated, they reveal an even wider, stranger, and more heartbreaking story. The demand for mummified remains was so voracious that it consumed not just the human inhabitants of ancient Egypt, but its animal ones as well. Let's go back to that 19th century supply chain. You're the European agent in Cairo, placing your orders, while your primary business might be human mummies for the pigment and medical trades. You quickly become aware of another, even more plentiful resource: animal mummies. The ancient Egyptians didn't just mummify people as a core part of their religious practice. They mummified millions upon millions of animals. This is a well-known archaeological fact. Specific animals were associated with specific gods. The cat was sacred to the goddess Bastet, the ibis the baboon to Thoth, the god of wisdom, and the crocodile to the fearsome god Sobek. Pilgrims would travel to temples dedicated to these gods and, as an act of devotion, would purchase a mummified animal to offer to the deity. To meet this demand, entire industries developed around the breeding and mummifying of these animals. Archaeologists have discovered vast catacombs packed floor to ceiling with the mummified bodies of cats, dogs, birds, and reptiles. We're not talking about a few thousand. One catacomb at Saqqara is estimated to contain the remains of up to 4 million sacred ibis birds. Another nearby held hundreds of thousands of mummified cats. These were not beloved family pets, they were purpose-bred religious offerings, mass-produced for the faithful. For the 19th century tomb robbers and dealers, these animal catacombs were a jackpot. They were often easier to access than human tombs and contained a staggering volume of organic material. What was this material used for? While some of the more well-preserved animal mummies were as old as curiosities to European collectors, the vast majority met a far more ignominious end. The most common use was for fertilizer. In the 1892, a huge deposit of cat mummies was discovered at the site of SP or Sortie Midors. A commercial company won the rights to mine the site. They dug up the mummified cats, packed them into sacks, and shipped them to Liverpool, England. The total shipment was estimated to be around 180 cats, weighing about 19 tons. They weren't destined for museums. They were sold at auction to be ground into fertilizer and spread on the fields of English farmers. The auctioneer reportedly used a mummified cat skull as a gavel. But what about painters, where we enter a more speculative but fascinating area of debate? Could some batches of mummy brown have been made not from humans, but from animals? It's highly plausible. A colour man in London receives a crate labelled Mummy Egypt. Inside is a jumble of dark, resin-soaked, mummified remains. Would he be able to tell the difference between a human arm and, say, the torso of a mummified crocodile? And more importantly, would he care from a purely material standpoint? The composition would have been similar: desiccated organic matter, down, and embalming resins. This is a point of ongoing discussion for conservation scientists. When they get that chemical signature of bitumen, calcium, phosphorus, and degraded proteins, can they distinguish between human and non-human animal sources with current technology? It is extremely difficult. DNA analysis is a possibility, but finding viable DNA in a 150-year-old paint film made from a 2-year-old body is a monumental challenge. So it's possible that some of the mummy brown used in 19th century paintings was, in fact, cat brown or ibis brown. This adds another layer of the bizarre to the story. An artist striving to paint a noble portrait might have been using a pigment made from a mummified house cat. A painter depicting a dramatic biblical scene could have been shading it with the dust of a sacred baboon. This industrial use of animal mummies highlights the sheer scale and utter lack of sentimentality in the 19th century view of ancient Egypt. Nothing was sacred. If it could be dug up, it could be sold. If it could be sold, It could be ground up. Culture, religion, and life itself, whether human or animal, were all rendered down into raw materials. The silent, staring eyes of those millions of cats, birds, and dogs, mummified in an act of devotion, ended their millennia-long journey not in the afterlife they were promised, but as a nutrient for English crop soil, just maybe, as a streak of shadow on a painting in a quiet European gallery. The tragedy of Mummy Brown was not just a human one. The story of Mummy Brown is so uniquely strange that it feels like a complete anomaly, a singular moment of madness in the history of art. But if we pull the camera back and look at the broader history of pigments, we find that while it might be the most macabre, it was far from the only bizarre or ethically questionable color on the artist's palette. It belongs to a whole family of weird and wonderful pigments with unsettling origin stories. Let's step into a hypothetical museum of weird pigments. Mummy Brown would have its own grisly display, of course, but right next to it, you'd find a vibrant, glowing yellow with an equally strange, if slightly less gruesome, backstory. This color is called Indian yellow. For centuries, European artists were obsessed with this pigment. It was a luminous, transparent, deep yellow that was perfect for painting sunlight and golden fabrics. It arrived in Europe from India in the form of crumbly, foul-smelling balls. But for the longest time, no one in Europe knew exactly what it was made of. The recipe was a closely guarded secret. The truth, when it was finally confirmed in the late 19th century, was stomach-churning. You are now in a small village in Bengal, India. You see a herd of cows, but they look unhealthy. Their bones showing. Their diet consists of almost nothing but mango leaves and water. This specific diet, while damaging to the cow's health, caused them to produce a brilliantly yellow urine. The cowherdess would collect this urine, heat it to precipitate the yellow solids, press the resulting sludge into balls, and dry them over a fire. These pungent balls were then shipped to Europe to become the beautiful, glowing Indian yellow. The practice was eventually outlawed in the early 20th century due to its extreme cruelty to the animals. So, while one artist was painting shadows with a mummy, another might have been painting sunlight with the product of a sick cow's urine. This is a well-documented historical fact, though for a long time its veracity was debated. Let's move to the next display in our museum. Here we have a deep, rich purple. This is Tyrian purple, the most prestigious and expensive dye in the ancient world. It was the color of Roman emperors and senators. To wear a toga with a stripe of Tyrian purple was a sign of immense power and wealth. Why was it so expensive? Because to produce a single gram of the dye, you needed to harvest and kill thousands of a specific species of sea snail, the Bolinus brandaris. Each snail has a tiny gland that, when exposed to sunlight and air, produces a few drops of a mucus that turns a brilliant, permanent purple. It's estimated that it took as many as 250 snails to produce just 1 ounce of dye. The shores around the ancient production centers in entire modern-day Lebanon were said to be piled high with mountains of discarded snail shells. And what about red? For centuries, the most brilliant red available was carmine, also known as cochineal. This color is still used today in food and cosmetics, often labeled as carmine or cochineal extract. Its origin are in South America. Looking at a prickly pear cactus, on its surface are what look like white, fuzzy growths. You scrape one off and crush it between your fingers. Your fingers are stained a deep, vibrant crimson. These are cochineal insects, tiny scale insects that live on the cactus. They are harvested, dried, and crushed by the thousands to produce the reed dye. It takes about 70 Darrow insects to make 1 pound of cochineal. There's an academic debate that links some of these pigments together. Did the existence of a market for bizarre animal-derived pigments, like cochineal insects or sepia cuttlefish ink, make the idea of using mummies seem less strange? Some historians argue that it created a material mindset where artists into seeing the natural world and its creatures as a vast catalogue of potential colors. In a world where you made purple from snails and red from bugs, making brown from a preserved human might have seemed like illogical. if extreme, mixed up. Placing Mummy Brown in this context doesn't excuse it, but it does help us understand it better. It wasn't an isolated madness. It was part of a long, pre-industrial tradition of artists using whatever they could find in the natural world to create their colors. It was an era before synthetic chemistry, an era that relied on a kind of strange and often brutal alchemy. They were all, in their own way, more than human pigments, blurring the line between the living world and the artist's canvas. Mummy Brown was simply the most extreme and ethically horrifying example of this long-standing practice. Seeing it alongside these other strange colors helps us understand that the quest for the perfect color has often led humanity down some very weird and disturbing paths. The story of Mummy Brown is a product of a specific time, a time with a profoundly different set of values, a time when a dead body from another culture was seen as a raw material, a scientific curiosity, or a party favor. But our story doesn't end in the 19th century, or even with the last tube of paint in 1964. The final chapter is being written right now, in the way we have learned to see the past and the dead. It's a chapter about respect and, where possible, return. Let's step away from the artists and the colormen and back into the world of archaeology. But you are no longer the pith-helmeted explorer of the early 20th century. You are a modern archaeologist or bioanthropologist. Your tools are not just trowels and brushes, but DNA sequencers, CT scanners, and ethical review boards. Your mindset has undergone a fundamental revolution. The driving principle of your work is no longer extraction, but preservation and understanding with minimal disturbance. The most important tool in your kit is respect. You now see the ancient mummy not as an object, but as a human being. This is a major, well-established shift in the field of archaeology and museum studies over the last 50 years. When a new tomb is discovered today, a rare and momentous event, the approach is radically different. Instead of dragging the mummy out for an unwrapping spectacle, you would most likely perform a virtual autopsy. You would take the entire sarcophagus to a medical facility and run it through a CT scanner. This non-invasive technology allows you to create a perfect 3D digital model of the body inside. You can see the person's skeleton, identify signs of disease or injury, and even discover amulets docked within the wrappings, all without ever unrolling a single bandage. You can learn almost everything you need to know while leaving the individual's physical form intact, preserving their dignity in a way Thomas Pettigrew could never have imagined. This respect extends to the mummies that have been sitting in museum collections for over a century. You, as a modern researcher, might be involved in a project to re-examine your museum's collection. You study the mummies not for their potential as a pigment, but for the stories they can tell us about ancient life, their diet, their diseases, their family relationships, which can now be revealed through isotopic and DNA analysis. You are giving them back their humanity, piece by piece. And this leads to the most significant development, the movement for repatriation. This is the effort to return human remains and sacred objects from Western museums back to their communities of origin. The most famous examples involve the return of ancestral remains to Native American tribes or Aboriginal Australian communities. But Egypt is also a part of this global conversation. Egypt has been actively unsuccessfully campaigning for the return of its stolen heritage. While they may not be asking for paintings containing Mummy Brown back, they are asking for the return of major artifacts and, in some cases, human remains. A little-known fact is that this isn't just a recent phenomenon. As early as the 1982, the Egyptian Museum in Cairo made a significant ethical decision. They closed their public royal mummy room, feeling that the open display of the bodies of their ancient kings and queens was a violation of their dignity. The mummies were moved to a more respectful, private setting. They have since been redisplayed, but in a much more somber and tomb-like environment, presented as revered ancestors, not as thrilling exhibits. In April 2021, this new attitude was put on stunning display. The world watched as Egypt held a pharaoh's golden parade. In a lavish, multi-million-dollar procession, The mummified bodies of 22 ancient kings and queens were transported from the old Egyptian museum to the new National Museum of Egyptian Civilization. They traveled in custom-built, climate-controlled vehicles designed to look like ancient funerary boats. The event was framed not as moving objects, but as respectfully relocating revered heads of state. It was a powerful statement about national identity and the proper treatment of the dead. There is, of course, a debate here. Western museums that hold Egyptian artifacts often argue that they are world museums, preserving human heritage for all people. They claim to have the resources for conservation and research that may not be available elsewhere. The counter-argument from countries like Egypt is simple: that heritage was stolen, and its rightful place is in its country of origin, where it has the deepest cultural and historical meaning. This debate over who owns the past is one of the most critical ethical discussions in the modern world. This final chapter reframes the entire story of Mummy Brown. The pigment was born from an attitude that saw these bodies as having no value beyond their material properties. Today, we see them as priceless, not for the money they could fetch, but for the knowledge they hold and the human lives they represent. The journey from commodity back to respected ancestor is complete. We have finally learned to leave the dead to their rest, and in doing so, we have perhaps brought a small measure of peace to the countless, nameless ghosts who were sacrificed for a prettier shade of brown. And so, we find ourselves back where we started, in the hushed, empty halls of the art museum after hours. You are standing in front of the same painting one last time, the enchanted sleep. The marble floor is just as cool, the air just as still, but the painting is no longer the same because you are no longer the same. The journey is complete. You look at the knight in his dark armor, standing in the moonlit forest. You see the sleeping princess. But now, when you look into the shadows of the painting, you see the entire story. The brown is no longer just a color. It is an archive. It is a monument to a forgotten history. In those transparent, layered shadows, you can see the sun-scorched hills of Thebes and hear the faint, distant echo of a Picasso striking stone. You can see the dark hold of a merchant ship, smelling of brine and decay, making its slow way across the Mediterranean. You can hear the crunch and groan of the industrial grinder in a London workshop. You can see the polite shopkeeper recommending the pigment to an eager young artist. You see the look of horror on Edward Burne-Jones's face and picture the small, lonely funeral for a tube of paint in his garden. You see the last mummy, sitting silently in a warehouse for decades, a forgotten relic of a forgotten trade. You see the whole, first, improbable, and horrifying network of people and places that were required to create that specific patch of darkness on the canvas. The painting has become a portal, a window into a past that is far more complex and troubling than the romantic legend it depicts. This is the ultimate fate of Mummy Brown. It has become a story, a powerful, cautionary tale that art historians, curators, and scientists now tell. It's a mainstream historical lesson about the ethics of collecting, the blind spots of the past, and the ways in which art is never separate from the world it was created in. It teaches us that materials have memory, and that even the most beautiful objects can be haunted. But knowing the full story does something else, too. It adds a strange, final layer of depth to the artwork, a layer of tragic irony. A pre-Raphaelite artist, obsessed with truth and detail, used a material whose truth he couldn't even comprehend. An artist painting a scene of enchanted sleep used the remnants of those whose eternal sleep had been brutally disturbed. The painting, a work of fiction, has been accidentally infused with a terrible, non-fictional truth. There is a final, lingering academic question that we are left with. Does this knowledge ruin the painting, or does it, in a strange way, make it more powerful? Does understanding the darkness behind the shadows diminish their beauty? Or does it add a layer of profound, tragic resonance that the artist never intended? There is no right answer. The painting's meaning is now a dialogue between the artist's original vision and the historical reality that we have uncovered. You look at that wall. luminous brown one last time. It's a color born of misunderstanding, greed, and a profound disrespect for the dead. It was a terrible, unethical, and chemically unstable pigment. And yet, you have to admit, it is beautiful. The way it captures the light, the depth it creates, it's undeniable. It's a terrible beauty. A beauty that asks us to hold contradictory ideas in our minds, at once the aesthetic wonder of the object and the ethical horror of its creation. This is perhaps the final lesson of Mummy Brown. It reminds us that history is never simple. It's messy, contradictory, and often deeply uncomfortable. We can't undo the past. We can't scrape the ghosts from the canvas. All we can do is choose to see them, to acknowledge them, to understand their story, and to learn from it, ensuring that such a thing may never happen again. The museum lights begin to dim for the night, and you turn away from the painting, leaving the night to his eternal vigil in a forest of shadows that you will now never forget. The story is over, but the images remain, floating gently behind your eyes. The deep, rich brown of the shadows, the dust motes dancing in the light of a torch in a long-sealed tomb, the glint of a glass muller on a stone slab. These fragments of the past are now part of your own quiet, inner world as you begin to drift. The crisp edges of the story soften, blending into the gentle hum of the room around you. The journey from the ancient ends of Egypt to the hushed galleries of Europe now seems less like a history lesson and more like the strange, meandering logic of a dream. You feel a sense of peaceful distance from it all, as if you were watching the tale unfold from a great height, seeing the threads of connection that span centuries and continents, the voices of the artists, the tomb robbers, the scientists. They all fade into a gentle murmur, a soft background noise that rocks you slowly, steadily, into a deeper state of rest. There are no more questions to answer, no more debates to solve. There is only the quiet, the calm, and the slow, easy rhythm of your own breathing, carrying you away from the waking world and into the soft, welcoming darkness of a well-earned sleep. The end of the article. Good night.